Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the what if.
Chapter 7 More training and several surprises. He frowned hard, almost glaring as he willed the shadow to move faster. The stupid leaf was going to hit the ground before he could. This is rare. You're up early. Shikamaru jerked up, his concentration breaking instantly, and he could only watch in glum dismay as the shadow he had been extending shrank back to normal size. A few feet away, the leaf fluttered to the ground to join several more, all sitting innocently on the damp spring grass. Shikamaru wanted to stomp on them. With a sigh, he flopped backwards, the cold grass under him coming as a relief to his skin while the morning dew soaked through his shirt. Tilting his head back to look at his father, he grumbled, "To-san, you couldn't have come a few seconds later. I almost had it." Shikaku stared from his son to the small pile of leaves. He had woken up about an hour ago, getting ready for another day at work. It had been mere chance that he had glanced out a window and had seen his son perched on one of the compound's hills under the 6 o'clock sunrise. He had done a double take, wondering if his mind had been playing tricks on him as he had squinted against the morning light. Curious, because his son never rose before 8:30, he had gone out to investigate. "You were practicing?" he asked, mildly dumbfounded. Shikamaru scowled before switching his gaze to the sky above. The sunrise splashed streaks of soft orange across the gradually brightening blue, and lit up the clouds themselves. "Yeah, but it's troublesome. I've decreased the time for my jutsu by a couple seconds, but that's it." His scowl grew fiercer. "I'm getting beaten by leaves." Shikaku stayed silent for a moment longer, wondering if he was still in bed and actually dreaming. "How long have you been out here?" he asked carefully. Oh, about half an hour." Shikaku breathed an inward sigh of relief. At least he had woken up before his son. "Would have been longer, but making eggs is harder than it looks. Shoulda paid more attention when Ka-san was teaching me." Shikaku's jaw almost dropped open. What? He moved forward to look down at his son. "Then when did you wake up?" Shikamaru frowned up at him. What was wrong with his dad? Was the man always like this in the morning? 4:30. Stayed in bed for a while. Why? Shikaku looked around for a genjutsu, and then, finding none, pinched himself for good measure. God, this was real. This was surreal. "Shikamaru," he finally asked faintly. "Why aren't you still in bed?" Shikamaru sat up, propping one knee up to rest his right arm on. "I told you, I'm practicing. Haruki-san said my Kagashibari no jutsu needed to get faster. You were there yesterday. You heard him." Shikaku pinched the bridge of his nose before dropping down beside his son. "I didn't hear you cooking." He glanced sidelong at Shikamaru. The Nara heir shrugged, dropping his arm to cross his legs. "I used one of the kitchens in the guest houses. Didn't wanna wake Ka-san up." They both sat in silence for several seconds as Shikaku digested this. His son, who usually didn't want to get up before noon, had gotten up before 5, cooked himself a breakfast, and was now training because Haruki said so. Shikaku prodded. Shikamaru frowned quizzically at him. "What? You mean breakfast? He told me I should eat more. Your mother and I tell you to eat more." Shikaku pointed out indignantly. Shikamaru scowled again. "Yeah, but you two didn't put me through a workout hard enough to almost kill me. I was exhausted yesterday, and I didn't even really feel it until after the mission was over." He raised a hand and absently studied the wrist Haruki had held yesterday, missing the silent amazement on his father's face. "I mean, you had to carry me halfway home. I couldn't even walk the entire way. But he said that eating would help, so." He trailed off, shrugging, and Shikaku made a mental note to hunt down the red-haired Junin and thank him. Shikamaru usually preferred sleeping to eating, and his appetite had adjusted accordingly, dwindling down to something bordering on unhealthy. He and Yoshino had often worried when Shikamaru only ate small portions during meals, and that was only when the boy could be bothered to drag himself to the dinner table, usually after his wife had yelled at him. If he had known that putting his son through strenuous exercise would get him to change, he would have done it ages ago. "And what are you doing now?" Shikaku prompted, turning to look at the pile of leaves. Shikamaru scratched his cheek, smudging a bit of dirt there. "Leaves are lighter, so I'm trying to catch their shadows before they hit the ground. But it's hard, and I'm already tired. He scratched his head and then sighed before heaving himself back on his feet. Well, whatever. I almost had it the last time. He shot his father a dark glower as he made his way over to the leaves again. Would have too if you had walked slower or something. Shikaku shrugged apologetically before remarking, I would have thought you'd sleep in today. Ino managed to squeeze an extra hour out of Asuma after all. Shikamaru frowned, scuffing at the grass around the leaves. That was the plan, but I woke up at 4:30 and couldn't get back to sleep. Kept thinking about this stupid jutsu, so I figured I'd just get up and do something about it. Stooping down, he picked up a handful of leaves and tossed them into the air. Scrambling back to his position a few feet away, he activated his jutsu and concentrated on the dancing shadows, extending his own as fast as he could without losing control. There. 2 leaves froze in midair as his shadow snagged theirs. Quickly, he redirected his shadow to several others, grinning in spite of himself as he caught 3 more. The others fluttered to the ground, but he congratulated himself on paralyzing 5. He had only been able to catch 4 10 minutes ago. Letting his hands drop back into his lap, he watched the leaves fall back onto the ground before turning to his father. See that? My time improved again. If I can just. Shikamaru trailed off as he noticed the odd expression on his father's face. To-san. Shikaku blinked and then reached out to pluck a stray leaf out of his son's hair. If you keep this up, I might have to invite Haruki to come live with us. Unfortunately, he was only half joking. The red-haired Junin was turning out to be a very good influence on his son, plus he was a great shogi player. And he had a feeling that his wife would instantly like the redhead as well when she found out about Shikamaru's new eating habits. Shikamaru flopped backwards again, blowing away a strand of hair that had escaped his ponytail. That would be troublesome. He'd probably have me out at the crack of dawn to train. That wasn't a. No. Shikaku snapped his gaze down, speculating on whether or not his son had realized what he had inadvertently said. Judging by the half-lidded eyes, probably not. Well, Shikaku rose to his feet, glancing up at the sky. He still had time to spare. All help. He moved to the pile of leaves and picked up a handful, noting the way Shikamaru hurried to an upright position again without complaint. He didn't think anything could motivate his son until after his first mission gone wrong. That was what had happened with him after all. His first botched mission had sent him home in frustrated tears and gut-clenching fear when he had been too weak to protect both Inoichi and Chusa. Both of his teammates had ended up in the hospital for 3 weeks, their sensei had ended up dead, and Shikaku had ended up with 2 knife wounds gouged into his face, a lifetime's reminder of his failure. After that, he had never skipped out on training again. But he hadn't counted on Kazama Haruki appearing, and as Shikamaru sent out his shadow again, Shikaku thought that maybe, because of this unexpected development, he could step up his son's training earlier than he had planned. Huffing as she stepped through the side door of her family's flower shop, she wiped her brow and downed the rest of the water in her bottle. She almost choked when a familiar voice sounded behind her. Ino, what are you doing? Where have you been? Coughing, Ino spun around, frowning at her father. Otu-san, don't scare me like that. Inoichi held up his hands in a placating gesture. Sorry, but where have you been? It's 7:30 in the morning. Ino stretched before reaching up to tug her hair tie holding her hair in a bun. Practicing. I can go up and down buildings with no problem now, and I'm getting faster at regulating my chakra so I won't have to stop whenever I turn a corner. Inoichi stared, barely registering the words as he stared at his daughter's hair. Ino, is your hair? Oh, you noticed. Ino beamed brightly at him. I cut it a little, earlier this morning. It actually looks pretty good like this, doesn't it? And it's still long, so Sasuke-kun will still like it. Inoichi ignored the reference to the last Uchiha, he had been doing that for a few years now, ever since his wife had reassured him, multiple times, that it was one of those crushes that would go away sooner or later, that it wasn't serious so he wouldn't have to go and have a little chat with the boy, and asked, somewhat bewildered, but why did you cut it? You love your hair. Ino scoffed, tossing her empty bottle in their recycling bin before rummaging through a cabinet for a clean towel. Don't be silly. 2-san. It's not like I shaved it all off. I just shortened and thinned it a bit. When I swung down yesterday to get past the Hokage's door, my hair almost threw me to the ground. If it hadn't been for Shikamaru and Choji, I would have failed the mission. Oh, Inoichi said rather stupidly. Just last week, he had been yelled at for suggesting that Ino trim her hair. Teenage girls. He'd never understand them. He racked his mind for something other than what the hell is going on here. Quote. You woke up early to train. His daughter shot him an annoyed look. That's what I said, Otu-san. Mo, what's wrong with you this morning? Are you usually like this at this time? She checked the clock on the wall. It is kinda early. Do you need coffee? I need to see a doctor, Inoichi thought absently. Out loud, he voiced carefully, Ino, you're not usually up this early. What brought this on? Ino shrugged, wiping her face with the towel. I couldn't sleep. I mean, I did sleep, but then I woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep again. A slightly embarrassed smile. I thought that maybe if I left it too long, I might forget what I learned yesterday, so I headed out to practice. She turned and moved deeper into the shop, making for the stairs that would lead up to the interior of their house. Inoichi followed, still feeling somewhat lost. Wait, you just asked Asuma yesterday for an extra hour to sleep in. Now, instead of doing that, you get up early and go out training. When did you get up anyway? Around 6. I didn't leave till 6:30 though, since I had to eat breakfast first. And I told you, I couldn't sleep. I just kept thinking about that stupid door. Inoichi dragged a hand over his eyes. It was too early for this. He had woken up at 7. Since when did his daughter find the ability to wake up earlier than he did? But why? He asked, flabbergasted. What about all that stuff you said about beauty sleep and dieting and other stuff? He twitched when Ino turned an arched eyebrow at him. Sometimes, he hated the fact that his daughter was so much like him. Well, Ino's voice was generously patient as she entered the kitchen. Haruki-san said I needed to work on my stamina and chakra regulation. And if I really train like I did yesterday, I'll just burn away anything I don't need. And my hair's not going to look the same afterwards anyway, so I figured that I might as well be practical. A bun is much easier to work with. I can look good after training once I take a shower. Quote. So all this is because Haruki gave you some advice. Ino shrugged again as she broke out a bowl of cereal and took a seat at the dinner table. Well, it would be kinda embarrassing if I haven't improved at all when he comes to train us again. Inoichi stayed silent as he sat down across from Ino. This was very strange. Usually, his headstrong daughter didn't care about training. Granted, she had gone through the mother of all D ranks yesterday, but Inoichi had been more afraid that Ino would be put off of training after going through the difficulty of Haruki's training exercise. Obviously, his worries were completely unfounded. So you've improved then? He asked lightly. Ino grinned at him, bouncing to her feet again. Watch. A moment later, she had scurried up the side of the kitchen wall, pausing only for a few seconds before settling herself firmly on the ceiling. Ta-da! I'm pretty fast now, aren't I? It took me at least 10 seconds to switch surfaces yesterday. Inoichi stared in shocked silence. It was true. Ino had taken quite a while every time she had wanted to step onto another surface during the D rank. Quote. Haruki said he'll be coming again next week, right? Ino walked back down to flat ground and took a seat again. Yup. And I can show him our flowers then. She stopped talking, looking suddenly contemplative, and Inoichi frowned. Something wrong? Ino poked at her cereal. Not really. Just. She paused again before glancing up at him, eyes unusually somber. Do you think we could ask him over for dinner next time we see him? Inoichi blinked, feeling rather taken aback. He hadn't been expecting that. I don't mind, I suppose, and your mother should be alright with it, but why? His daughter flushed a little, quickly finishing off her cereal before moving away to put it in the sink. I'm not sure, she said at last, turning back to him with a thoughtful frown marring her features, so like his own when his own thoughts fell on something important. But you know how you always tell me to try to look into a person and not just at whatever front they put up. Inoichi nodded. That was one of the top rules of a shinobi, and the top rule of an interrogator. Well, I don't always do that. Ino looked a little sheepish. But I tried to with Haruki-san yesterday. Because whenever he smiled at me, or at Shikamaru or Choji, she shifted a little when Inoichi abruptly leaned forward, interest piqued. He had learned, years ago, that sometimes, children saw things down to their very core far easier than adults. His smiles always seemed a little sad. I thought that maybe he had lost friends or children of his own or something, so I tried to look a little closer. You know, like I'd glance at him when he wasn't talking to anyone, when he was just listening to us. And what did you see, Ino? Inoichi asked quietly. He had done the same, and he wondered if Ino had arrived at the same conclusion. He had seen grief and sorrow, and thought, perhaps, that the red-haired Junin had lost quite a few people close to him. But his daughter tilted her head, blue-green eyes sad in a way that made Inoichi want to punch something to make it go away. Loneliness, Ino answered softly, rocking back on her heels. He looked really lonely, too-chan. Inoichi stilled, a little stunned as he thought back to Haruki's brilliant cerulean eyes. He remembered the way his daughter had gotten more affectionate near the end of the tree-walking exercise, and she had chattered on about everything and nothing throughout lunch, telling the red-haired Junin about her everyday life. Maybe that hadn't all been just gratitude and friendliness after all. Sure. He nodded briskly. I'll talk to your mother about it. When he comes by next week, invite him over for dinner. Ino brightened immediately, leaning forward to give him a kiss on the cheek. Thanks, Tu-san. She danced out of the kitchen. I'm going to take a shower now. Start on some breakfast. I'm still starved. Inoichi chuckled as he rose, absently putting on the kettle. A war veteran. That was what Haruki reminded him of. And even though he had retired, he still kept tabs on the T&I division, but he hadn't heard anything about a shinobi getting therapy from anyone there. Haruki had just returned from an 8-year-long mission as a spy. Surely at least a mental checkup was necessary. All shinobi returning from extended infiltration missions had to go through it. He would go see the Sandaime later, Inoichi decided. Maybe Sarutobi just hadn't noticed yet. If even the Yamanaka clan had brought it up, the Hokage would agree, and maybe Haruki could get some help. In the meantime, he'd make sure to insist when the redhead inevitably turned Ino's dinner invitation down. XX. One more lap. That should be enough for today. Trying to keep his breathing steady, he jogged past the main gates again, ignoring the dubious looks the guards kept throwing at him. This is unexpected. Choji. Did something happen? Choji started, almost tripping before catching himself and slowing to a stop to watch his father approach. Oh, good morning, Tu-chan. I'm just running a few laps. I see. Chusa squinted at his son, noting the flush of exertion in his cheeks and just managing to stop himself when he made to check for a fever. Ah, why? Choji shrugged a little, still breathing hard. I need to work on my stamina. Oh, Chusa glanced at the guards standing by the main gates. Good. It wasn't just him. They looked as lost as he felt. Is this because of what Haruki said yesterday? His son nodded. Yeah, I promised I'd work on it. I see, he repeated, wincing inwardly when Choji gave him a strange look. But it was hardly Chusa's fault that he had somehow woken up in the twilight zone this morning. Shouldn't you eat breakfast first? Exercising without food is bad for you. Choji brightened a little. Oh, I already ate. I made my own breakfast this morning since Ka-chan was still asleep. You already? Chusa was starting to feel slightly alarmed. It's barely 8. When did you wake up? Choji frowned in thought, glancing up at the sky for a moment. Well, I woke up at around 6:30, but it took me a while to get breakfast ready, so I didn't start doing laps until around 7:10. And how many laps have you done? Chusa asked weakly. Well, this would be my 10th, his son shifted, looking embarrassed. I'm kinda slow at the moment, but the compound's pretty big and I don't think I'd make it if I went any faster. Chusa mentally traced the border of his compound, wondering if it had shrunk sometime in the night. 9 laps around the compound in less than an hour. He had no idea Choji had it in him at this age. It seemed that his son was pretty good when he actually put the effort in. All this because Haruki gave you some advice? Chusa asked incredulously. Choji nodded, oblivious. I promised I'd work on my stamina. He's coming back to train us next week, remember? I have to be better by then. Shuza had a hard time keeping his jaw off the ground. But why? Asuma's been training you for the last 2 weeks and you weren't out here training so early then. Choji scratched his head before swinging his arms a little. Quote. Yesterday's mission was really hard, Tu-chan, he admitted unexpectedly. I was exhausted after it was over. That's never happened when Asuma-sensei trained us. I'm not saying he's bad, Choji tacked on hastily. I wouldn't trade Asuma-sensei for anyone, but he's never pushed us like Haruki-san did. Shuza stared down at his son, recalling the lack of motivation in all 3 of the newest generation of Ino Shikacho. He had expected it. It had been the same with himself and Shikaku and Inoichi. Occasionally, he still felt a twinge of guilt whenever he caught sight of the scars on Shikaku's face, reminding him of a time when he had been too weak to protect his team and had had to fully depend on his teammate to get him home alive. When he had woken up in the hospital afterwards, he had been horrified when he had seen the price Shikaku had had to pay, and even more so at seeing the deep bags under the Nara's eyes and the guilt aging his friend's teenage face. After that, he had thrown himself into his training, determined to never place such a huge burden on someone else again. He had sworn to pull his own weight from then on, and he had never broken his word since. You could have given up any time yesterday. Shuza's expression turned thoughtful as he considered his son. Why didn't you? Like you said, the mission sounded pretty hard. It's not a requirement to do the mission Haruki's way. Choji surprised him by frowning fiercely up at him. I couldn't give up. Even Shikamaru didn't give up. But why not? Shuza persisted. Because Haruki-san never looked at me like he thought I couldn't. Shuza pulled back a little, blinking down at his son and feeling somewhat stunned. Choji's fists had balled instinctively as he barreled on. He showed us how to do the tree walking exercise and I reached the top before Ino did, and he knew I could work it out myself. And he wouldn't have given us that mission if he didn't think we could do it. The color in Choji's face deepened as he paused, before continuing, I know what other people think about me. They all think I won't be able to become a shinobi. Shikamaru and Naruto and Kiba were the only ones who didn't care. Haruki-san doesn't care either, and he gave us the mission as a challenge to see if we could meet his expectations, his head tilted up defiantly. And we did. Shuza stood frozen for a long while, studying the way his son seemed to stand more firmly now, a little straighter even though he was undoubtedly tired. He had never thought his son couldn't. Had always known that one day, Choji would become a great shinobi. But he had been content to let his son build his own confidence, guiding him with gentle reassurances that he would one day find real friends to stand beside. And Choji had found a great friend in Shikaku's own son, but was that really enough? What good were friends if his son didn't have the strength to protect them when it mattered? Is this your last lap? Shuza finally asked, watching his son blink in confusion at the sudden change in topic. Yeah, I want to get some more food and a shower before I meet Shikamaru. Okay. Shuza nodded, gesturing to the path in front of them. Mind if I join you? His son brightened visibly, beaming up at him. Sure. Tu-chan. Shuza smiled back and slowed his pace to match Choji's as they moved forward. Maybe he could see how his son was doing with their clan techniques during his spare time. If he was good enough, Shuza could start him on something more advanced. His mind turned to the red-haired Junin he had finally met personally yesterday. Inoichi had been with Haruki all day, hadn't he? Shuza would locate his former teammate later and find out more about this man that had made such a huge impact on his son. Hokage-sama, with all due respect, what do you mean ease? Fine. I know a ninja's psyche better than anyone, and I am telling you that Haruki is anything but fine. Inoichi glared furiously at his Hokage, part of him wondering how he had gotten into a full-out, if rather one-sided argument with the Sandame. He had skipped out on another day of work at the flower shop and made his way to the Hokage Tower instead, planning to drop a word to the Sandame about Haruki so Sarutobi could do something about it, and that would be that. Said plan had been thrown out the proverbial window when the Sandame had listened patiently to his concern and then promptly shut him down with an Inoichi, Haruki-kun is fine. He does not need help. Inoichi had blinked and thought maybe Sarutobi hadn't understood, so he had proceeded to list out the things he had seen in the red-haired Junin, throwing in the fact that Haruki had just returned from a long infiltration mission for good measure. But again, he had been assured, as if he didn't have eyes, that Haruki was fine, and that there was no need to worry. The entire conversation had quickly gone downhill from there, with Inoichi growing increasingly frustrated at the Hokage's adamant refusal to see sense. Inoichi respected and admired the Sandame, he really did, but he did not appreciate someone else thinking that they could do a better job than he could when it came to the mind. When it was obvious, even to his daughter, that there was something wrong with the redhead. So what had started out as a pleasant request had quickly dwindled to a forced calm, through gritted teeth sort of dispute, with Inoichi doing most of the teeth gritting. Now he stared darkly at the man in front of him, unsympathetic even when Sarutobi heaved a tired sigh. Inoichi, Sarutobi started again, and if he said, "Fine," one more time, Inoichi would start shouting, "The guards within hearing distance be damned. There is nothing we can do. I trained the T&I division myself," Inoichi snapped in a low voice. "I can pick someone out to at least guide Haruki through the first stage of therapy, someone who knows how to be discreet if need be. Give him at least that much. Inoichi," and this time, Sarutobi's voice was a mixture of warning and resignation, but not the resignation Inoichi was looking for. "We cannot help him." Inoichi's mouth closed with a near-silent click, staring in utter disbelief at his Hokage. Even the shinobi that had come out of the Third War so worse for wear that Inoichi had only needed to take one glimpse at the outer layer of their mind to know that they were beyond help had gone through every stage of therapy. Sarutobi had ordered it back then, even when Inoichi had insisted that it would be futile, so why wouldn't the man at least let him try now? What made Haruki different? Why not? He finally grounded out tightly. What makes him different? Why can't we help him? Sarutobi released another heavy sigh, eyes somber under his hat. Because we could never understand what he is going through. Because all the people who could ever help him right now no longer exist. I am sorry, Inoichi, but in this matter, I ask you to trust me. Cease and desist from pursuing this issue any further. That is an order. Inoichi stared hard at the aging man. That was it. Some vague response about not understanding. Since when had that ever stopped the Sandame? He wanted to ask, to demand a real answer, but the hard expression on Sarutobi's face told him that he would get nothing more out of the man. He had been ordered to stand down and was expected to do so. But this wasn't right. Since when did Konoha just give up on its shinobi? Since when did the Hokage just admit defeat and leave a man on his own to deal with his own problems? Inoichi closed his eyes. He knew, more than most, just how delicate the mind could be. But at the same time, it was a precious thing, with thoughts and memories and feelings all entangled together, and it was this very reason that had made him retire from active duty. Because no matter how many times he did it, he simply couldn't get used to tearing another human's mind apart for answers, intruding, raping, until he found what was needed. To see someone's mind suffering, especially when that someone had helped his daughter and had become something of a friend, was a kind of torture all on its own. Inoichi. Inoichi's lips thinned as he opened his eyes again, effortlessly pulling on the impenetrable mask that he had perfected over his long years as an interrogator, and met his Hokage's gaze again. As you wish, Hokage-sama, he nodded stiffly, trying to ignore the disgust curling in his gut, at Sarutobi, at himself, at the situation in general. Without a word, Inoichi spun on his heel and stalked out of the office, closing the door behind him with a quiet but sharp bang. He pulled up short when he turned and found a familiar figure leaning against the wall beside the office door, arms crossed and staring ahead without moving. Shikaku. Inoichi frowned a little when his former teammate tilted his head to give him a sidelong look, eyes grave and mouth a grim slash across his face. The Junin commander looked every bit his rank at the moment. Inoichi glanced around, spotting the two guards that Shikaku had most likely sent away when he had heard him talking to the Sandame rounding a corner. Wordlessly, they moved away from the Hokage's office, heading back downstairs in heavy silence. Neither said a word until they reached Shikaku's office, and Inoichi closed the door behind them as they walked inside. Glaring moodily out the window as Shikaku stationed himself at the edge of his desk, arms folding together once more, Inoichi snapped, "That's bullshit. Haruki's still walking and talking. As far as I'm concerned, that's all the requirement a shinobi needs to start healing." Shikaku was much calmer as he watched the blonde pace and rant in his office. He had been on his way to the Hokage's office to pick up the day's paperwork when he had caught Haruki's name and Inoichi's voice, the subtle undertone of anger clear only to himself and Chusa. Instinctively, he had sent away the 2 guards posted at the door, telling them to return in 5 minutes. Then he had settled himself beside the doorway and listened in on the conversation. Shikamaru was up at the crack of dawn this morning, Shikaku interrupted abruptly, stopping Inoichi in mid-tirade. The best way to head Inoichi off before his anger became a full-blown paroxysm was to change the topic to something lighter but still somewhat related. He was training. Inoichi blinked at him before sighing, "You too, huh?" Ino was up early as well. Went out to polish up her chakra control. He stopped, shooting Shikaku a half-hearted look of accusation. "Stop trying to distract me. The Sandame's wrong." "You're not really supposed to say that," Shikaku remarked. "Unless he's wrong," Inoichi pointed out. "And in this case, he is." Shikaku sighed. "You are so troublesome. Ever thought that maybe the Sandame might have a good reason to think that Haruki can't be helped?" "So you agree with him?" Inoichi scowled angrily. "You think we should just leave Haruki?" "Hey, I didn't say that." Shikaku's voice came out uncharacteristically sharp and it silenced Inoichi immediately. "Haruki got my son to start eating properly again. Yoshino and I have been trying to do that for years, and he succeeded in a day. If anything, I owe him. But I think you and I both know that there's something bigger going on here, and whatever it is, Haruki's right in the middle of it. Before we do anything else, we should find out more about this whole situation first." They stared at each other for a moment, only stirring when a knock at the door sounded. "Come in," Shikaku called out, wondering if he should at least look like he was working. He would have to make another trip up to the Hokage's office for his paperwork later. "Inoichi, Shikaku, good morning." Chusa walked in, raising an eyebrow when he sensed the tension in the air. "Are not so good." "Oh, close the door," Inoichi grumbled, taking a seat at the couch on one side of the office. "It's been one hell of a morning." "I have to agree." Chusa shut the door behind him, eyes focusing on Inoichi. "Choji was up at 6:30 this morning, and he ran 10 laps around our entire compound in about an hour. Stamina training apparently. I thought I was still asleep." "Join the club," Shikaku snorted. Shikamaru was the same, and he got up even earlier than that. And Inoichi's girl was practicing chakra control. "So what's wrong with you two then?" Chusa eyed them quizzically. "I was surprised, but not in a bad way." Shikaku and Inoichi exchanged a look before the Nara head recounted the conversation with the Hokage. By the time he finished, Chusa was frowning, glancing at Inoichi from time to time. "I don't know much about Haruki. Definitely not as much as you two," Chusa finally spoke. "But even if it was just some random shinobi, shouldn't the Sandame at least book them a check-up appointment at the hospital? That's usually a requirement for all of us." "Exactly." Inoichi leapt to his feet again, ignoring Shikaku's warning look. "But I already checked, before I went to see Sandame-sama, just to make sure Haruki didn't already have an upcoming appointment. He doesn't. And I know the Hokage told us that he's destroyed all of Haruki's records, but how exactly does that account for the fact that no one knows him? I asked some of the older medics at the hospital to see if Haruki had dropped by and didn't bother signing in, but none of them even knew who I was talking about. They've never heard of him before." "That's a good point, actually." Chusa gestured behind him at the door. "I've heard the other Junin and Chunin talking about Haruki. Some of them have seen him walking around and want to know who he is. They've been waiting for him to come to the station for days now, but he hasn't stopped by even once." He frowned again. "Not very social, that one, except with our kids." Shikaku stayed silent as he watched his two friends debate back and forth. His mind called up the seal that had been briefly activated when Haruki had entered the Nara compound but said nothing of this. He had, indirectly, given his word that he wouldn't say anything about it, and he wasn't about to break it. Sighing quietly, he recalled his son's words the day before, after he had come back from Ichiraku's. Haruki had apologized, and hadn't seemed to have any problems interacting with Shikamaru yesterday. "Oi, Shikaku," Inoichi's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "What do we do about all this?" Shikaku shrugged, straightening as he let his arms drop back to his sides. We keep doing what we're already doing. Talk to him when we see him, ask our kids about him. But leave him alone, Inoichi. He raised a hand when Inoichi opened his mouth to protest. I meant about therapy. Feel free to spend time with him, but I don't think Haruki would want anyone even bringing up the suggestion of someone poking around in his head. He paused, smiling grimly as his two former teammates exchanged glances. I think we can all agree that he's hiding something, and it looks like the Hokage is in on it. If Sandaime-sama is going out of his way to override even your request, Inoichi, just to help him, then whatever this secret is, it's big and it's important. We don't want to mess with something like that until we know what it's about. Makes sense. Chusa approved first. We keep this to ourselves. And from the rest of the council. He added. There are certain members who don't need to know. Shikaku inclined his head. They all knew the very real threat hiding in the darkness of Konoha. Fine, Shikaku, Inoichi relented grudgingly. But are we really going to just cool our heels and wait for, what? For the Hokage to bring us into the loop, if he ever does that? Shikaku smirked. Of course not. Give me a little time. One more shogi game with our mystery Junin should provide me with enough information to figure all this out. Inoichi snorted and rolled his eyes while Chusa chuckled. Shikaku glanced out the window as both accepted the plan. He would figure it out. An idea was already starting to form in his mind, especially after considering the demonic chakra sensory seal in his house. Exactly what he was going to do about it afterwards was the real question. XX. 3 days after his training session with Team 10, Haruki was sitting in his favorite ramen stand, reclining against the counter and staring idly up at the sky outside Ichiraku's as Kakashi sped through a meal beside him. The copy nin had become something of a constant in Haruki's life, appearing without warning whenever the mood suited him. For the most part, Haruki didn't mind. Kakashi knew how to stay quiet, and usually just read his Ika as he accompanied Haruki around town. Oi, aren't you going to finish that? Haruki glanced at his companion and then at his half-finished ramen. God, had his appetite really diminished so much? He hadn't really noticed when he was living on the battlefield, subsisting on ration packs and adrenaline. No, he answered curtly, throwing some change on the counter as he rose to his feet. I'm finished. He didn't expect the firm hand on his shoulder pushing him back onto his seat. Finish it. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed at him. You can't tell Sakura to eat more and not do the same yourself. Haruki frowned at the copy nin before grudgingly picking up his chopsticks again. It didn't matter what time he was in. He knew better than to argue with Hitaki Kakashi unless it was a matter of life and death. Forcing down the noodles, Haruki thought back to the last 3 days. Kakashi hadn't asked questions when he had taken to walking circles around the village, even though Haruki was sure that the copy nin had drawn his own conclusions. He had been avoiding several people for a while now, and said people might find him if he stayed in one place for too long. Shikaku had almost cornered him several times already. Haruki knew a Junin commander didn't have that many reports to pass to different Junin while they were off duty, but the Nara clan head had started to scour the village with a stack of folders tucked under one arm. Haruki had witnessed the man personally demanding a late mission report from a mildly alarmed Genma only a few hours ago. If Shikaku was looking for him, then Haruki had no doubt that Inoichi was also, at the very least, keeping an eye out for him as well, so he had avoided the Yamanaka flower shop like the plague. The former interrogator would probably detain him until he managed to contact Shikaku. And then, of course, there was Anko, whom Haruki had been ducking and dodging from since the irritating woman had recovered from chakra depletion. He had no idea how she did it. There was no way she could sense his chakra signature, and yet she always managed to pop up when he least expected it. He supposed he should count himself lucky that Sarutobi hadn't given out his address yet. Anko's coming this way, Kakashi suddenly remarked, and Haruki stiffened, tuning back into reality and quickly pinpointing the Kunoichi's chakra signature. Speak of the devil. With an inaudible curse, Haruki leapt up, gave his nearly finished ramen a cursory glance before ducking out of the ramen stand, Kakashi a step behind him. What exactly did you do to piss Anko off? Kakashi asked idly as they hurried away from Ichiraku's. Haruki shot the copy nin a deadpan look. The man had had a good laugh when he had realized who Haruki was trying to avoid most of all, but he had helped once or twice by delaying her when she got too close so he couldn't complain. Nothing, he muttered. Trust me, she's not angry with me. Or if she is, it'll be because she found out that I've been avoiding her. Kakashi looked contemplative as he glanced behind them to make sure they weren't being followed. Did you sleep with her? Haruki almost tripped over his feet as spluttered a little at the copy nin's question. What? No. What the hell gave you that idea? Kakashi shrugged, eye smiling at him in a way that made Haruki want to punch him. Ma, she's been stalking you for the past 3 days. Only 3 things can keep Anko that interested in someone. You've pissed her off so much that she can't get over it without doing some serious injury to your person. Good sex, and she wants another round, or new sweets, in which case she'd go to Kurenai. Haruki looked horrified. I swear you just called her a whore. She's not that bad. And she likes to train. Kakashi nodded in agreement. But she doesn't have to take an interest in someone when she's training. And liking good sex doesn't necessarily make someone a whore. Just shows good taste. Haruki felt his face warm. Damn Kakashi. He had no problem reading the crap his godfather doled out, and even editing it was fine, but he usually drew the line when other people's sexual habits were brought up, especially for someone whom he had come to see as an older sister in his own time. So if you didn't piss her off and it's not sex, Kakashi continued languidly. Why is she chasing you? Haruki scowled. Because I did her a small favor and she's decided that talking about it is the best course of action right now. Kakashi eyed the redhead thoughtfully. Must be quite a favor. Why don't you just let her buy you some dango or something and get it over with? Haruki huffed irritably. Because she'll ask questions, and I'll most likely not wanna answer them. Kakashi nodded without comment as they sped down another street. This was one of the reasons why Haruki didn't mind having the copy nin as a tagalong. The man simply took everything in stride without batting an eye. Of course, that didn't mean he wasn't nosy about other issues. Mind if I ask you a question then? Haruki glanced warily at Junin, now eye smiling disarmingly at him. What? When did you become Anbu? It took everything Haruki had not to let his sudden apprehension surface on his face as he racked his memories of the last few days. What did Kakashi mean? He hadn't said anything about being Anbu. Ma, Kakashi's right hand reached out to brush briefly over his left shoulder. If you don't want people to find out, you should keep that hidden at all times. Haruki stopped walking, and Kakashi slowed to a halt a few feet in front of him, body half turning to face him. When? The copy nin's dark eye, no longer half-lidded and lazy, studied him even as he answered. Day before yesterday, when you joined us for training again. You weren't wearing your coat and you got your shirt wet after you went to get Naruto and Sasuke out of the river. You took it off to dry it, and you only had a sleeveless underneath. He shrugged carelessly. It was only for a few minutes, the kids didn't see. But, he trailed off and Haruki cursed violently inside his head. God damn it, what kind of amateur mistake was that? He had completely forgotten about his Anbu tattoo. And of course, Kakashi would see it because the man was always looking underneath the underneath, quite literally in this case, even when he looked like he was doing the complete opposite most of the time. I won't say anything. Kakashi looked stern all of a sudden, as if Haruki's silence was questioning the copy nin's integrity as a friend. I'm just curious. I know next to nothing about you. Haruki started walking again, slower this time as Kakashi fell into step beside him once more. He knew the copy nin wouldn't leave all the holes in his life alone for long. It was in the man's character to puzzle out anything that piqued his interest. But could he afford to let Kakashi know some of his real past right now? Then again, he already knew about Haruki being in Anbu. The copy nin would have figured out that the edited version of his life so far was absolute crap. Absently, Haruki reached up to rub his shoulder. Anbu tattoos were normally placed on the right shoulder, and almost all shinobi had it drawn near the elbow so that arm guards or bandages up the arms or even just elbow warmers could cover it more easily if they ever needed to go undercover and henge wasn't an option. But he, being the stupid idiot that he was, had decided to copy a certain ex-Anbu and had asked Tsunade to place it high on his left shoulder for the whole damn world to see. He had thought it a good idea at the time though. Kakashi had been the first Anbu, albeit former, that he had ever met personally. And of course, now he was paying for it. He sighed and resigned himself to answering a few questions. At least he could hold the copy nin off for a while. 16. He finally replied, glancing to his left to meet Kakashi's interested gaze. But the Hokage had me work solo. That was true enough. Tsunade had put him on a few solo missions. Of course, they had mostly been on the battlefield, but his squad had technically been recalled to the village while he had stayed and flitted between the other teams, helping out as best he could. So, solo. Next to him, Kakashi nodded in acceptance and asked nothing more. The copy nin seemed content with the one truth, however simple, that the redhead had given him. It made Haruki feel just the slightest bit guilty, but he quickly shoved that sentiment away. It wasn't like he was lying, merely settling for half-truths. The Junin station's up ahead, Kakashi pointed out after a few minutes. Want to stop by? Haruki waved a hand, already turning to a different direction. You go. I don't really know anyone there. Yet again, he found a hand on his shoulder that pushed him firmly towards the station. Sorry, Kakashi said cheerfully, not sounding sorry at all. I didn't mean you actually had a choice. There are several people who've all seen you around and, even worse, have seen me walking around with you. Their curiosity got the better of them and they wouldn't stop bothering me yesterday until I agreed I'd bring you in today. Haruki spluttered indignantly, trying to tug himself away from the copy nin's grip. You don't have to walk around with me. Go hang out with Asuma or Kurenai or something. I'm sure Gai-san will be happy to see you. The mask Kakashi wore didn't do anything to hide the grimace that surfaced on his face. Don't even joke about that, he ordered with a shudder. That's just disturbing. I spend enough time with Guy on missions. Any more and he'll drive me over the edge. Haruki rolled his eyes, trying to dig in his heels. Then you should have found Asuma or Kurenai. You don't mind their company, do you? I don't mind your company, Kakashi pointed out bluntly. And I definitely don't mind spending my free time walking around town reading Ika Ika. But a quick introduction will get the others off my back, so that's what I'm doing. Before Haruki could protest any further, the copy nin had shoved him into the headquarters, almost plowing him straight into a startled Kotetsu. Catching himself just in time and dodging around the Chunin instead, Haruki straightened and shot a glare at Kakashi. He twitched when the man simply smiled at him and pulled out his book. With an irritated sigh, Haruki turned back to Kotetsu. Sorry about that. He's an asshole. Kotetsu released a startled laugh, glancing at the Junin behind the redhead. No worries, he blinked curiously at the man in front of him before recalling the latest gossip around the station. Hey, you're that Junin nobody knows Ao. Azumo came up behind his partner, ignoring the scowl being directed at him as Kotetsu rubbed his head and focusing on the newcomer instead. Ignore him. He's a bit slow when it comes to manners. I'm Azumo. The idiot's Kotetsu. Haruki smiled a little, hiding his discomfort at seeing the younger versions of two old friends. He had gotten to know many of the older generation of shinobi during the war. Kotetsu and Azumo, along with Genma, Raida, and Yugo, had made up Squad 14, and their tent had been stationed next to Haruki's. I'm Haruki, he offered. Nice to meet you. He glanced back sharply, suppressing his annoyance when he found Kakashi deeply immersed in his book. Hey, he swatted at the orange book. If you're gonna drag me here, at least have the decency to introduce me to whomever it is you wanted to introduce me to. Kakashi heaved a long-suffering sigh, as if Haruki was the one who had insisted on coming, the bastard, and lowered his book to look around. These were two of them, actually. He nodded at them. Kotetsu, Azumo. The two Chunin stared dubiously at the lazy hand Kakashi waved in their direction. Last time they checked, the copy nin had gotten away before any of them had managed to force him to bring the red-haired Junin around. What was the man trying to pull? Noting the suspicious looks he was receiving from his two colleagues, Kakashi quickly ushered Haruki further inside the lounge. He hadn't exactly been planning to bring the redhead here, it had been more of a spur-of-the-moment thing. But after spending some time every day with Haruki, Kakashi had quickly realized that the other Junin didn't interact with anyone. Oh, he talked to Kakashi, of course. He didn't have much of a choice there, what with the copy nin accompanying him around town and all, and it wasn't as if Haruki was rude. If someone talked to him, Haruki always replied. And the redhead obviously talked to his students, helping him train them by giving advice and tips and holding conversations with them during their breaks. But that really was it. Kakashi had watched Haruki walk around the village, blue gaze darting here and there, soaking everything in with a hungry sort of desperation as if it was the last time he would ever see any of it, but never actually stopping to chat with anyone. Didn't the redhead have any friends he wanted to talk to after 8 years apart? He was sure Haruki was from Konoha though. The moving here from another country idea had been dismissed after noting how Haruki never got lost no matter where he went. But so far, Kakashi hadn't seen anyone who recognized the former Anbu. After finding out about Haruki's previous rank, he had immediately gone to the Anbu headquarters and wheedled the roster out of the second in command. The man still owed him a favor and Kakashi didn't need to see his face to identify his confusion when the copy nin used it to get his hands on the register for a few minutes. To his great dissatisfaction, even after scanning all the names twice, including the Miyas and Kias, he had still been unable to find Haruki amongst them. Beyond frustrated, Kakashi had reluctantly considered that the Hokage had had them destroyed in case Haruki had been caught, though something about that just didn't sit right with him. So he had gone back to spending his afternoons with the red-haired Junin, surprised at how content he was with simply walking around with one of his books and occasionally running away from the people Haruki was avoiding like the plague, which was another mystery Kakashi had to solve. Haruki really was something else to give Nara Shikaku enough cause to comb the village for 3 days straight in an attempt to find him. Kakashi found it even more amazing that their commander was currently failing. Now, Kakashi was by no means a sociable person. He went out for drinks with Genma, Asuma, and Kurenai and Guy, if Kakashi was unfortunate enough, on occasion, but he usually sat to the side with his book, half listening to his friends' easy chatter and perfectly content to fade into the background. He'd join in sometimes, and his friends always seemed glad to include him in their conversations, but sooner or later, he'd return to his Ika and they'd leave him to it. It was different with Haruki. With him, Kakashi usually found himself starting the conversations. And when they weren't talking, Haruki had never voiced a complaint as they walked through the streets of Konoha with Kakashi's nose in his adult literature. Most of his friends, even Genma, had, at one point or another, complained about his reading habit, either embarrassed or annoyed or both, but the redhead barely seemed to notice, as if he was used to hanging around someone who publicly flaunted a hobby that would make most people blush. And while Kakashi was half pleased, half sulky that he had finally found someone who was immune to his quirks, he didn't think it was all that healthy for Haruki to simply cut himself off from the rest of the population. So, when he had seen the Junin headquarters, he had decided to use his colleagues as an excuse to at least introduce Haruki to the other shinobi their age. If the redhead didn't have friends, then Kakashi would simply have to make sure he got new ones. Once upon a time though, he never thought he would see the day when he would be voluntarily pushing someone else to make friends. Yo, Genma, Kakashi called out, and the Senbon wielder turned, the bored look on his face fading as his eyes flickered between them. You wanted to find out who this is. Haruki. Genma, Haruki. The redhead nodded politely. Nice to meet you. Genma eyed the Junin curiously for a moment, chewing on his Senbon. You sure you're just a Junin? He finally asked, face blank. Word has it that our commander's been running all over town looking for you. Didn't believe it myself, till he showed up at my front door demanding my report and asking if I had seen you. Haruki blinked, feeling a little taken aback at the question. Genma was usually more laid back than this. Was he annoyed that? Haruki stiffened and then relaxed when he caught a hint of a smile tilting up one corner of the man's mouth. Loosen up. Genma waved a hand at the far end of the lounge where 2 other shinobi were seated. Come join us. Everyone's asking about you. We've never seen Shikaku-sama so active when there's nothing going on. A minute later, Haruki was settled between Genma and Kakashi, Katetsu and Izumo on the right across from him and Yugo and Gekko Hayate on the left. He sat stiffly in place, not quite comfortable being surrounded on all sides. There was no immediate way out if he had to run. You're not in a war anymore, he chastised himself firmly. You're among friends. Or at least colleagues. So, instead, Haruki tried to relax and concentrated on the other 2 shinobi as they introduced themselves. Unflinching, loyal Yugo, whom Haruki had worked beside on more than one occasion, was smiling contentedly in a way that he had never seen before. His gaze drifted to the man sitting next to her and knew him to be the reason. Haruki had never known Gecko Hayate, only that he was the proctor during the final rounds of the Chunin exams and that he had been killed trying to take down Baki. He had also found out, later on, that the man had been skilled at kenjutsu but a chronic illness had held him back from his full potential. He frowned a little as Hayate coughed, rasping and harsh. In his time, Sakura would eventually develop a cure for the lung infection, something even Tsunade had been unable to do, but that had been years from now, and judging by Hayate's pallid features, he didn't have years. Sakura had once explained the process to Haruki, but he had never been very good at listening to scientific lectures and had inevitably fallen asleep. Still, Kurama had heard the same thing. The fox could tell him later and Haruki would send it on to the medics at the hospital. He would be able to save this man, in more ways than one, and Yugo would never lose that smile again. So why is the commander looking for you? Yugo asked, leaning forward. The red-haired Junin seemed nice enough, if a bit tense looking. Perhaps some casual conversation would put him more at ease. Ah. Haruki glanced at Kakashi, who was absolutely no help as he slouched against the couch, his porn out in the open again. He probably wants to play shogi with me again. They all looked surprised. Just a shogi game? Katetsu asked, puzzled. You must be pretty good. Haruki tried not to scowl at that, and then dropped the attempt and scowled anyway when Kakashi spoke up from behind his book. He's excellent. Shikaku-sama wants a rematch after he lost last time. Feeling a tick develop over one eye, Haruki reached out and swiped the copy Nin's book in retaliation. Oi! Give that back. Kakashi narrowed his eye in warning as he jolted upright. Haruki scoffed and tucked the book away inside his coat. No. You can have it back later. If you're going to talk, then you're not allowed to read. The other shinobi watched the exchange with wide eyes and dropped jaws. No one got their hands on Kakashi's precious books. The copy Nin was usually too quick, and most people were smart enough not to try it anyway in case they incurred the man's wrath. They stared as Kakashi glowered for a moment longer before slumping back against the seat, posture suspiciously sulky. But there was no sudden spike of killer intent and the copy Nin made no attempt to take his book back from the red-haired Junin. Who was this man? Genma hastily closed his mouth before his senbon slipped out. Kakashi, if I had known that taking that book away from you was all it took for you to pay attention, I would have done it ages ago. The copy Nin shot him a sour look. Why would I want to pay attention to you and your latest sexual escapades? Genma looked mildly offended but didn't have the chance to defend himself when Yugo kicked him. Oh, be quiet, you two. Haruki doesn't need to hear your crap. She turned a warm smile on the redhead. Well, now I know who to go to when Kakashi's being more of a pervert than usual. Haruki released a soft laugh at that. Glad to be of service. Don't think I can do much about him being late all the time though. They shared grins as they glanced at the copy Nin. Kakashi had recovered his usual lazy-eyed look that still somehow managed to convey his disdain. Hayate stifled another cough before enquiring, but it's true. You beat Shikaku-sama in a game of shogi. Haruki sighed but nodded. At the rate this news was being revealed, he was honestly surprised that it wasn't all over the village by now. Azuma whistled. Impressive. I think Genma played him once. The commander completely destroyed him in 15 minutes. Genma shot him a good-natured scowl. I didn't see you lining up to try. Besides, he said he'd give us an extra day off if one of us beat him. He turned to Haruki to explain. It was the day after New Year's and the party we had the night before was crazy. Someone spiked the alcohol so that painkillers wouldn't work the next day. Everyone came in with a hangover and no one wanted to work. You should have seen this place. Most people just stumbled in and went right back to sleep on the couches. Or the floor. Wherever there was space. Then Shikaku-sama came in looking ridiculously not hungover. Guess all that alcohol he usually drinks on a daily basis is good for something. Yugo laughed as the others grinned in reminiscence. That was a hellish day. Even as Anbu just stood by the walls feeling sick. Anyway, he took one look at us and broke out a shogi board. That sadist enjoyed every minute of it. I mean, there we were, Elite shinobi queuing up one after another across from Shikaku-sama trying to stave off the jackhammers in our heads while attempting to beat the greatest shogi player in existence at his own game. I don't know what we were thinking. Guess that day off didn't happen, Haruki remarked with a grin. Katetsu grumbled. Hell number. Azumo and I were back on gate duty within the hour. It was torture. Azumo rolled his eyes, annoyance flashing across his face. What are you talking about? You fell asleep the moment we sat down. I was the only one working. Katetsu waved a dismissive hand in the air. We're partners, Zumo. We share the pain. Azumo snorted but didn't have time to shoot back a retort as the door to the headquarters slammed open. Where is he? There is no way I can miss someone for 3 days straight, Kurenai. I'm no Kakashi, but I'm not that bad at tracking. I swear he's. Anko abruptly stopped talking as she found 7 pairs of eyes focused on her. And one of those belonged to the very person she had been searching for the last 3 days. You, she barked, striding forward and only dimly aware of Kurenai following close behind. The one time I'm not looking for you and I find you right away. Where have you been? Haruki heaved an inward sigh as he offered a weak smile in the kunoichi's direction, suddenly finding himself the center of attention again. Hello, Anko. I've been around. How are you? How am? Anko stalked forward, ignoring Katetsu and Azumo even as they shrank away from her and stationing herself directly in front of the redhead. How do you think I am? Aren't you supposed to check up on your patients afterwards? And after removing my Anko? Haruki tried to interrupt, stiffening in alarm. Cursed seal, at least have the decency to stick around so I can repay you. Dead silence met her words and Haruki closed his eyes and willed the whole situation away. Needless to say, it didn't work. You call removing Orochimaru's cursed seal a small favor. Kakashi couldn't quite hide the mix of incredulity and amazement that seeped into his voice as he watched the redhead's shoulders slump in defeat. Why did finding things out about Haruki always have to be a battle? Most people would be boasting from the rooftops if they managed something of this magnitude. Anko, I told you to be careful about who you say that around, Kurenai cut in sharply, stepping up beside the irate kunoichi who hadn't seemed to notice the tense atmosphere. Why do I have to do that? Anko snapped back irritably. Let Orochimaru find out. I'll gut him when he comes to investigate. That's not the point, Kurenai chided, glancing with some concern at the fatigue aging the redhead's face all of a sudden. You should talk about it with Haruki first. For his part, Haruki was suddenly fighting an onslaught of pain and nausea. It felt like a headache, but even Anko wouldn't have caused something like this. Kurama, what the hell's going on? It's started. I was afraid of this. What's started? What's going on? You're fighting a paradox, Kit, against the laws of the universe itself. There are bound to be repercussions. Repercussions? I was fine a second ago. There's no way any consequences could just hit me like this. Kurama growled crossly, pacing in Haruki's mindscape. What do you think I've been doing all this time? My power has been holding back the backlash, but it's not enough anymore. Think of it as a sickness. You humans are full of those, aren't you? Well, if it's a sickness, then what are the symptoms? God, I feel like I'm going to throw up. Headaches, for one, like right now. You'll probably start coughing up blood later as the paradox attacks your physical state as well. The hell? And how exactly am I going to fight Madara if I belong in a damn hospital? I'm not finished, brat. These episodes won't happen often. Only once in a while. Outwardly, even if a medic does a scan of your vitals, nothing will look wrong. Your power level will be the same as usual too. I said to think of this as a sickness, but you're not really sick. These symptoms are just warnings. Warnings. Of me dying. You're still thinking of this as an illness. It's not. We are not going to die. We will disappear. There's a difference. Our existence in this timeline will be erased because we do not belong here. Because there's another version of you running around who could still be like you, so, time paradox. Understand? I guess. But I'll still be alright otherwise. There'll just be pain from time to time. Yes, I suppose you could say that. Though the episodes will get progressively worse as your time here shortens. That's fine. As long as I have enough strength to finish what I have to do. I think my headache's passing. Shit, I've been quiet too long. We'll talk more later. You really should have told me all this earlier. Ko, you've finally done it. Yelled someone to death. That's a first, even for you. Shut up. He's not dead. And it's not like you didn't say anything, Hitaki. I didn't yell at him. I was only commenting on something he said earlier. Would both of you shut up? Neither of you are helping. Shouldn't we lay him down or something? Move over, Azumo. Not like that, Katetsu. Geez, you suck at taking care of sick people. Well, it's a good thing I'm not a medic nin then, isn't it? Damn, he's light. Doesn't he eat anything? Put him down. He doesn't like being touched too much. Calm down, Kakashi. He's just moving him to a more comfortable position. So now what? Do we dump water on him? No, Anko. And you men aren't helping matters by crowding him. Kurenai, help me out here. A hand brushed against his forehead and Haruki instinctively flinched away, trying to fight his way back to the outside world. He hadn't even felt himself lose consciousness. With a near inaudible groan, he forced his eyes open, blinking as his sight cleared and he found himself staring up at a worried-looking Yugo. Haruki smiled wistfully. The Kunoichi had always been a bit of a mother hen. She had definitely taken care of her squad and friends as fiercely as a mother would her children. Haruki. Kurenai appeared in his line of sight, a bottle of water in hand. Can you sit up? Haruki nodded tightly, mind racing as he tried to think up a good excuse for passing out. He accepted the water silently, remembering not to check for poison and thanking her with a nod as he avoided their gazes. Sorry, he finally offered, capping the bottle. I didn't mean to do that. Anko made a skeptical sound at the back of her throat. I doubt anyone would want to faint on purpose. She was still scowling fiercely, but her voice was carefully lowered, and she had backed up a few paces from where Haruki was currently sitting. Are you all right? Kakashi finally shuffled forward, pushing past Kurenai to crouch down in front of Haruki. Do you need to lie down some more? Haruki shook his head, mentally noting that his headache was gone and the nausea had receded. I'm fine. Just felt a bit lightheaded. He smiled reassuringly. Guess I should have eaten more ramen earlier. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed, obviously not buying it, but said no more, rising to his full height as Haruki stood up. I'm all right now. Haruki turned to Anko. And if you want to repay me, don't spread the fact that your cursed seal's gone any further. Please. Anko stared back for a long moment, studying the redhead carefully. Fine, she consented at last, before glaring around the room. Pretend you didn't hear me, she ordered. Everyone's sweat dropped but nodded without reluctance. Anko turned back to Haruki, frowning at him. Why though? Orochimaru will find out eventually. Yes, Haruki agreed, allowing his expression to darken. And it'll be one hell of a surprise for him then. He glanced around before deciding to expand a little. They all looked far too curious for anyone's good. You all know about Hyuga Hazashi's return. There was a round of general nods. The news had spread like wildfire amongst the shinobi and most had already seen the Hyuga clan head's brother walking around at one point or another. Then you should know that there will be a meeting between the Hokage and the Raikage sometime soon. Haruki paused, considering his words. And after what happened the last time Kumo was invited into Konoha, the Sandaime won't allow them entry again, but neither will he want to meet on their home turf. The meeting will probably take place on neutral ground, in either Yu no Kuni or Shimo no Kuni. During that time, the Hokage will be out of the village, along with quite a few of Konoha's top shinobi. If Orochimaru were to find out something like this, he would take that opportunity to strike, since he knows his cursed seals won't work long-term anymore. Haruki stopped, glancing between his colleagues as they all stared back at him with something bordering on thoughtful surprise. I can see why you beat Shikaku-sama, Genma finally acknowledged, twirling his senbon in one hand. I haven't even thought about the meeting yet, but you're right. If this gets out, that snake will become a problem. We'll keep it to ourselves, Hayate agreed before peering at Haruki with open concern. But are you sure you're all right? Katetsu said you were really light. He was cut off with a few rough coughs. And people don't just pass out if they skip a meal. Ah, I'm fine. There's really no need to worry. And I've always been light, ever since I was a kid. Haruki smiled in a hopefully convincing manner. Why were they so worried anyway? They had just met him not an hour ago. If you're sure, Kotetsu was scrutinizing him closely as if staring hard enough might give him the real reason why the redhead was so light. Haruki wasn't about to indulge him and he quickly turned back Anko. You feel alright though? His gaze flickered to her neck. No sluggishness, no sudden bouts of dizziness. Anko shook her head. I feel perfectly fine. Lighter, actually. She brought a hand to her face, clenching and unclenching it thoughtfully. My chakra feels like my own for the first time since that bastard bit me. Haruki nodded. Good, you should be fine then. In the silence that followed, Anko suddenly looked awkward, glancing almost nervously at Kurenai. When the woman gave her a pointed look, the violet-haired Kunoichi flushed a little but turned back and stared squarely into Haruki's eyes. Thanks, Anko said gruffly. I didn't think anyone could get it off me. I appreciate it. If y'all ever need anything, just ask. It was with some effort that Haruki held back a fond smile. In his time, Anko had become something of an older sister to him. They had been similar in many ways, stubborn and short-tempered and hyperactive in public, somewhat quieter alone. You're welcome, Haruki smiled warmly at her, not noticing the startled looks around him or the fact that this action made him look much younger, putting a brighter light in his eyes as his features lit up. Thanks for trusting me. The red that rose in Anko's cheeks was quickly covered up with a fierce scowl. Whatever, pretty boy, I always pay my debts. Before Haruki could say anything else, Anko quickly motioned towards Kurenai. I hear you've met. Kurenai wants to ask you something. Haruki blinked, surprised, but obligingly turned to face the black-haired Kunoichi. Kurenai shifted, looking suddenly embarrassed. Well, actually, I have a request of sorts. I talked to Asuma a few days ago and he told me about your training session with his team. Wait, Kotetsu interrupted, taking a step forward. You're the one who made those genin walk sideways all the way to the Hokage's office. He grinned at Haruki's nod. Man, I wish I had been there. Must have been fun to watch. And those genin must be something else. Haruki nodded. They're the next generation of Inoshika Cho. They'll surpass their fathers one day. Confident, aren't you? Azumo eyed him curiously. One of them's our commander and the other two are nothing to laugh about. Their kids will have to work hard. Haruki just grinned back, relaxed and sure. They're going to be great. I guarantee it. Azumo exchanged a glance with Kotetsu, mouth quirking up involuntarily. Well, when put like that, it was hard to doubt the redhead's words. Then again, there was something about Haruki that made what he said believable, even if there was no proof. Haruki glanced back at Kurenai, already guessing what her request was. Would you like me to join your team for a day? Kurenai nodded with a smile. If you're not too busy. How about tomorrow? Haruki hemmed thoughtfully. He didn't have much to do tomorrow and he had already trained with Team 7 for the last 3 days. He glanced over at Kakashi who shrugged and I smiled his agreement. Sure, I'm free. When should I meet you? The Genjutsu mistress brightened. We usually start practice at 7 so just come to training grounds 16 around that time. Haruki nodded. I'll be there. A chirp from a nearby window distracted them and they turned to see one of the village's messenger birds perched on the sill. The bird spread its wings when it saw that it had been noticed and flew across the room to land on Haruki's shoulder. Its beak opened and a distinctive trill sounded in the lounge, the tune that summoned a Junin to the Hokage's office. Ah! Haruki straightened, nodding slightly at the bird on his shoulder. Message delivered. The bird took off again, disappearing as quickly as it had come. It seems that the Sandame wants to see me. I should get going. Before he could take one step for the door, Yugo quickly moved forward, frowning sternly at him. After your meeting with the Sandame, remember to go eat something. It's not healthy to skip meals. Haruki rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. The ramen wasn't exactly a meal, it was more of a late afternoon snack. But he doubted that Yugo wanted to hear that. Yes, ma'am. I'll get dinner afterwards. I'll make sure of it. Kakashi spoke up from beside him, lazy-eyed as ever as he turned to Haruki. I'll bring my team over again. Haruki immediately scowled and opened his mouth to protest but Kakashi beat him to it and compromised. We'll even bring the groceries, and I'll cook. Haruki's eyes immediately narrowed. You can't cook. Kakashi looked indignant. You've never tried my cooking. How would you know? A lifetime ago, you almost burned down my kitchen. You just don't seem the type, Haruki retorted. You can bring the groceries, but Naruto and I will cook. Kakashi looked almost sullen for a moment. You trust a kid's cooking skills more than mine. Haruki waved a hand in the air. Naruto lives alone. He has to be able to cook. Turning back to the others who all looked somewhat dumbfounded at their exchange, Haruki nodded at them. I'll be going now. It was nice meeting you all. Sorry for the trouble earlier. Several reassurances and see you arounds later, Haruki had disappeared from the station, coat flapping behind him. Seconds after he was gone, Kakashi was patting himself down, looking mildly panicked. He didn't give me back my book. Katetsu and Azumo guffawed while Genma and Hayate grinned. A laughing Yugo quickly explained to the two newcomers, and Anko and Kurenai quickly joined in at the horrified expression in Kakashi's visible eye. Serves you right, Hatake. Anko cackled. I hope Red doesn't give it back. It'll teach you a lesson about whipping that thing out in public. Kakashi huffed and poofed away without waiting to say goodbye. He would get the book back tonight, and maybe bring over a few copies of his other Ika as well and wave them around a bit in front of the kids. That would teach Haruki not to steal his precious literature. XX. Old man. Sarutobi glanced up with a smile, doing a quick scan of the time traveler as he activated the privacy seals. Still tired, he noted, and still a bit pale, not to mention thin, but at least it was better than when he had first arrived. Good afternoon, Haruki. Sorry to call you on such short notice, but the Raikage has finally replied. We'll be meeting them in Kuni 3 days from now. Their daimyo has agreed to lend us part of their land in the forested area outside of Yugakure for the summit conference. We have agreed to bring 12 shinobi each as our guard. I wanted to ask your opinion on that. Haruki blinked in surprise. This he hadn't expected. He had known that a maximum number of ninja would be set, but he had thought that Sarutobi would pick his own people. Well, he started slowly, going over the shinobi he knew. Hiyashi-san and Hizashi-san would have to come, of course. Sarutobi nodded in agreement. Having Shikaku with you doesn't hurt either, and you might as well bring the other clan reps with you too. It would probably be best if you showed a united front when it comes to the clans in Konoha. Sarutobi nodded thoughtfully. Sume and Shibi are both on a mission at the moment. That's why they weren't present at the council meeting concerning Hizashi. Then again, those two try to avoid council meetings as much as possible anyway. They should be done and rushing back though. No doubt, they've heard about the new development. They'll be back by the day after tomorrow at the latest, so they'll be able to join us. Chusa and Inoichi should agree as well. That's 8 in total. 8. Haruki mentally counted again. He came up with 7. Sarutobi arched an eyebrow at him. You will be coming along as well, Haruki. Haruki blinked. Well, that actually made a lot of sense. Right, of course. He smiled sheepishly. That's 8 then. I'd like Kakashi to come. Sarutobi nodded at the questioning look directed at him, finding himself mildly amused. Kakashi's grown attached to you. I don't believe he's ever voluntarily spent so much time with anyone. Haruki rolled his eyes. He's just curious. He can't figure me out. Ah, well, Sarutobi hid a smile. As far as he knew, not even curiosity could make Kakashi lose the aloof distance he usually set between himself and other people. The copy nin didn't have many people who called him friend, and even less people he called friends. Haruki was already one of the latter, whether either of them knew it or not. He will figure it out eventually. Eventually, Haruki agreed. But not right now. Sarutobi inclined his head. Who else then? 3 more. Haruki tilted his head in contemplation. Asuma, he finally decided. It'll show the Raikage that you trust blood as much as your other shinobi. I can guarantee that the Raikage will bring his own brother as well. And it'll mean a lot to Asuma. Sarutobi nodded. He had been debating on whether or not to bring his son, and was glad that Haruki had pushed his final decision for him. I'd like one Anbu with me as well, Sarutobi brought up. Haruki nodded immediately. I was thinking that we could bring Azuki Yugo. She's a captain, and she's dependable. Keeps a cool head in tough situations but fierce as heck when she needs to be. There will be a woman in the Raikage's party who will be a lot like her. Sarutobi nodded. He knew Yugo. The Kunoichi had been one of the Anbu he had picked out for consideration. And the last Quote. Hayate. Handy with a sword, works well with Yugo, and he's a Tokubetsu Junin. You should have at least one representative from that group as well. Sarutobi frowned. Gecko Hayate. Haruki, I'm not saying he isn't up to the standards of the other Tokubetsu Junin, but he does have that cough. Perhaps Shiranui Genma would be a better choice. Haruki shook his head. The sickness won't be a problem by the time we set out for the conference. My old teammate created a cure for it and she told me about it. I'll write it out tonight and then send it over to the medics at the hospital to sort out. They should have all the necessary ingredients already, and if Hayate rests for the next 2 days, he'll be fine when we head out. Besides, he added, you need Genma here. The other Junin respect him and he's calm and collected in difficult situations. He wouldn't be a Tokubetsu Junin if he actually got off his ass and took Junin exams. There's a reason he's one of the first people Shikaku talks to whenever there's a crisis. Sarutobi was silent as he mulled over Haruki's words. You seem to have a cure for everyone, Haruki. He smiled a little at the embarrassment on the time traveler's face. Very well, we'll go with that lineup. But you know that the people you picked will have to know the part you played in Hazashi's retrieval, right? Haruki nodded. I think they're all trustworthy people, and they know how to keep their mouths shut. He paused for a moment before adding, and I think Genma, Katetsu, Azumo, Raida, Kurenai, Gai-san, Enko, Hana, and Ibiki-san should be brought into the loop as well, even though they're staying behind. It would be better if someone in the village knows what's going on. Katetsu and Azumo. And Hana-chan. Aren't they Chunin? Haruki shrugged. Katetsu and Azumo will be on gate duty and Hana's in Inuzuka. We should probably have a tracker on standby just in case. I want them to know the full story if Kumo tries anything to sneak into Konoha. I trust them. Very well. Sarutobi glanced out the window at the setting sun. I'd also like my Anbu general and second to be there. Haruki nodded. He had worked under both in his time. Of course. Sarutobi nodded briskly. Then I think that's all for today. Wait, there's one more thing, Haruki cut in. There's something I want to talk to you about. It concerns the 2 Kumo nin I mentioned earlier, the Raikage's brother and the woman. I have an idea. Sarutobi's eyebrows got steadily higher as he listened to the redhead lay out his plan. It wasn't a bad idea. It wasn't a bad idea at all. Excuse me. Miki glanced up, blinking in surprise at the red-haired shinobi standing in front of her. She hadn't sensed anyone approaching. Quickly pasting on a polite smile even as she scanned the ninja with mostly a medic's eye, shadows under tired eyes, too pale, too thin, and partly a woman's eye, quite good-looking, even with the visible exhaustion. Man would be gorgeous when he was completely healthy, she asked. Hi, may I help you? The shinobi nodded. Could you direct me to the medic that usually treats Gecko Hayate? The medic nin frowned thoughtfully, quickly opening a file cabinet and flicking through the numerous dossiers neatly sorted there. Ah yes, you must mean Kano Takumi-sensei. He should be free in 10 minutes actually. She turned back, smiling again. Would you like me to book you an appointment then? The red-haired Junin shook his head. I'm only here to see him about Hayate. It won't take more than a few minutes. If you could just point me to his office and tell him that I'd like to see him, that'd be great. Miki pursed her lips. How could this man just stand there looking like death warmed over and tell her that he wasn't here for medical attention? The Junin seemed to sense her concern and smiled reassuringly at her. I am fine. Just had a late night. Miki glared at the shinobi, unimpressed. She was a medic nin for heaven's sake. But short of the Hokage's own order, it wasn't as if she could force him to see a doctor. Very well, she acquiesced reluctantly. I'll contact Kano-sensei and tell him to meet you in his office, She trailed off, glancing questioningly at the Junin. Kazama Haruki, came the prompt reply. Miki did a double take. This was the shinobi everyone was talking about. The crazy sensei that had made a team of genin practice their chakra control through the Hokage Tower, favored by the Hokage himself, and had practically been adopted by Konoha's famed Sharingan no Kakashi. Ma'am. Yes, of course, Kazama-san, Miki managed to splutter out, cheeks flushing at being caught staring. Just head up the stairs. Kano-sensei's office is the second door on the left in the east wing. Thank you. With a last grateful smile, the red-haired Junin left, leaving a flustered Mickey behind. XX. As Haruki waited patiently in the office, he flipped through the folder containing the information on the cure one more time. It had taken 5 hours last night to write everything out. Kurama knew the information, of course, but the fox's knowledge of it was a bit skewed. Apparently, demons just didn't retain human facts the same way humans did. The order, for one, really meant nothing to the Kyuubi. After all, what would it matter if one item went before another when demons simply used chakra to heal? But they had worked it out in the end, and by that time, it had been past 4 in the morning. The earlier dinner with Team 7 hadn't exactly helped either. He and Naruto had cooked up a meal fit for kings while Kakashi had wandered around with multiple copies of porn, pissing off Sakura and embarrassing Sasuke to no end. But they had gotten through the evening without needing too much damage control, and Haruki had promptly shoved them all out the door at 10. As he now tended to do, he had walked Naruto back next door, not leaving until the boy was tucked in and halfway to sleep. Closing the folder, Haruki sighed. Kakashi had been extra vigilant last night as well, hovering a few feet from him even as he teased his students as if afraid that the redhead would keel over at any given time. Haruki had been appreciative and annoyed in equal measure. Kazama-san. Haruki blinked and straightened up as a man in his late 30s walked in, medic coat flapping around him. He had thick brown hair and kind green eyes that reminded Haruki of Sakura's. Yes, that's me. Haruki offered a hand that was firmly shaken without hesitation. I'm sorry to bother you while you're working. Takumi waved a hand in the air as he ushered Haruki towards the 2 chairs by his desk. It's fine. I'm free at the moment. What can I do for you? Never one to beat around the bush, Haruki pushed the folder across the desk towards the medic. It's about one of your patients, Gecko Hayate. This is a cure for his sickness. Across from him, Takumi froze, hand hovering over the folder, eyes wide. You're serious? At Haruki's nod, the doctor quickly flipped open the folder, eyes keen as he scanned the contents. Haruki stayed quiet as the man read through his notes, waiting patiently for him to finish. Are you a medic, Nin? The quiet question didn't come as a surprise, though the fact that it was the doctor's first was. No, Haruki denied as Takumi stared at him with a sharp green gaze. But a while back, I met a woman, she was a medic, Nin, and she told me about a few things. This was one of them. I only recently returned from a mission and met Hayate for the first time. I recognized the symptoms and thought I'd pass on what I learned. And this medic Nin would be. Haruki smiled blandly at the doctor. She's dead. Takumi nodded once and pursued the issue no further, glancing back down at the file. Well, this is amazing. You've written out every step and it would only take a few hours to develop this cure. The process is simple enough. I suppose the only reason no one else has been able to create this is because the formulas are so complicated. They're completely based on each other. One mistake would throw the entire thing off. So you'll be able to heal Hayate? Haruki pressed. Takumi nodded again, a faint smile surfacing on his features. Most definitely. We'll call him in later today and start the treatment. Haruki relaxed and found himself smiling as well. That's great. Thank you. The doctor raised an eyebrow. I should be thanking you. You've just cured a supposedly incurable lung disease. He paused, a frown forming at his brow. I suppose I should ask now, how much would you say you'd want in return for giving this to our medical community? Haruki stared stupidly for several seconds. Want? Takumi tilted his head. Well, yes. What would be the cost of such information? Haruki blinked at the doctor, feeling completely out of his depth. Was this how medical circles worked? Buying and selling what might as well be people's lives? He shot to his feet, ignoring the startled look on the medic's face. Why would I want anything? He demanded, anger tightening his chest. Hayate's life is on the line here, as well as all the other people who have the same disease. I don't want you giving me money or whatever. I just want you to do your job and heal them. Haruki's voice had risen a little and he forced himself to calm down. It had been a long time since he had found anything to explode over, but this was something new. What if the medical community refused to pay someone's price for a cure? Did that mean that the patients who could benefit from it would be left to die? Weren't medics supposed to cherish life once they took their oaths? I apologize. Takumi's soft acknowledgement made Haruki narrow his eyes at the doctor. You have to realize that cures like this don't usually come freely. Haruki pressed his lips together but sat down again. Well, they should, he snapped darkly. What if the price is too high? What would happen to the patients then? Takumi studied the redhead carefully, trying not to smile. This Junin was one surprise after another. When Miki had told him of the shinobi waiting to see him in his office about Hayate, he had expected another friend come to insist on knowing if any progress had been made on the cure. He hadn't expected a cure to land, quite literally, in his hands. Takumi had been prepared to pay whatever price Haruki wanted. He liked Hayate and didn't want to see him or his lover and friends suffer more than they had to. But again, the Junin had surprised him, refusing payment and even taking offense at the implication. Most people do not think the way you do, Kazama-san, Takumi smiled somewhat deprecatingly. They only think of how much they can earn and forget that there are lives at stake. Or if they do remember, they do not care. Haruki snorted derisively. Then they're all idiots. There are enough people dying every day without greedy fools hurrying it along. Very true. Takumi nodded, not holding back a smile this time. He liked this shinobi. There weren't many nowadays with such honor. Then I can only say thank you, Kazama-san, and I promise you that Hayate will be cured as soon as possible. Haruki nodded and made to rise, but hesitated at the last second. Takumi frowned. Something wrong. There is one thing. Two, actually. The redhead frowned, looking troubled enough that Takumi immediately found himself wanting to promise anything Haruki asked, but he held his tongue and heard the man out. The first is that I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention my name to Hayate or Yugo or anyone else who asks about the cure. Takumi stared in utter bemusement. Did the man not want any credit? I can agree to that, he finally allowed. Though they'll want to know who to thank and I won't lie to them about it. Just tell them that I don't want them to know. Takumi nodded in agreement. And the other? The other. Haruki glanced at the office door before lowering his voice even further. It's pretty much the same as the first. Just don't tell anyone who gave you that cure. And since I gave it to you, you'll be heading its production, right? At Takumi's nod, Haruki continued, eyes intent, then please keep this away from Yakushi Kabuto. Takumi's eyebrows shot up, thoughts flickering through his eyes at light speed. Yakushi-kun, you say? As he observed the Junin staring back at him, Takumi thought back to the genin that usually helped out around the hospital. There had always been something about the young man that rubbed him the wrong way, but the other doctors and nurses all seemed to like him well enough and Takumi had never seen anything outwardly bad. Kabuto had impeccable manners, was always kind to the patients, and worked hard at everything he did. The general agreement in the hospital was that Kabuto took after Konoha's medic corps captain, but to him, Yakushi Taichi had something genuine about him that his adoptive son had never managed to inherit. I see, Takumi finally spoke. I don't have a problem with that, though this information will have to pass through his father before I can begin making it. Haruki nodded. That's fine. I hear Taichi-san is very well respected. Takumi nodded back and rose to his feet as Haruki did the same. Then I will get started immediately. Would you like me to send word to you once Hayate has been cured? Haruki shook his head. No need. I'll leave it to you. They shook hands again, but before Haruki could depart his office, Takumi called out one last time. Perhaps, sometime in the near future, Kazama-san, you'll come in for a checkup of your own. It seems you are in need of one, and just the other day, Yamanaka Inoichi came around to ask after you. Haruki stiffened momentarily before tossing a small smile over his shoulder. Thank you, Kano-sensei. I'll keep that in mind. Takumi shook his head as the Junin left. He had recognized the name the moment Miki had mentioned it, of course. But he hadn't really thought about the Yamanaka clan head until he had laid eyes on Haruki and seen the detrimental signs in the man's health. It was no wonder that Inoichi had come by to personally ask after the redhead if they knew each other. But that would be a matter for later. At the moment, he had made a promise to Haruki to get this cure out as soon as possible, and if he had his way, which he would because it was the very least he could do for the red-haired Junin, then Hayate would be cured before the day was out. XX. Kurenai stared critically at her students, holding back a sigh. Kiba was at it again, his short temper exploding over something Shino had said. She had just arrived herself, and hadn't managed to catch their no doubt one-sided argument. Hinata on the other hand was standing off to one side, hands wringing together and eyes darting nervously between her teammates. After hearing from Asuma about his team's sudden motivation, Kurenai had figured that it couldn't possibly hurt to invite Haruki to one of her team's training sessions as well. Perhaps he could help her pull these kids together. Kurenai almost started, quickly turning around to meet the startlingly blue gaze of the Junin she had just been mulling over. How did he do that? She hadn't been able to sense his chakra signature at all. Haruki, she smiled cheerfully in welcome. Good morning, you're right on time. I'm glad Kakashi hasn't been rubbing off on you. The boyish grin he sent her way lifted some of the fatigue from his face, though Kurenai frowned. Maybe she should sick Yugo on him again. He was obviously not getting enough rest. So these are your students. Kurenai nodded and quickly called the 3 genin over. They lined up in front of her, staring curiously, at least in Kiba's case anyway. Shino was as blank as ever and Hinata was staring at the ground, at the redhead. This is Aburame Shino, Inuzuka Kiba, and Hyuga Hinata. Guys, this is Haruki. He's the one who's going to train you today. What can you do? Kurenai winced as Kiba immediately piped up, bold and demanding. Haruki only smiled, calm and untroubled in the face of the younger version of his hot-headed friend. He had already been prepared to deal with these 3, and he was finding it easier to meet each of his old friends as he spent more time in the past. That depends on the team. He glanced at the kunoichi beside him. Do you have anything specific for them to do today, or can I just train them any way I want? Kurenai nodded. Go ahead. I've cleared their schedule today. Alright then. Haruki turned back to the 3 genin. Basically, we're going to play a game of hide and seek. Kurenai and I will be hiding. You 3 will be seeking. Kiba immediately scoffed. That's easy. Akamaru can find anyone. Haruki shrugged easily. There will be rules of course. Or rather, obstacles. I will be using cage buncheons for one. That would be a bit difficult for Akamaru, don't you think? Kiba frowned, glancing up at the dog perched on his head. Haruki pulled out 3 ribbons, 1 green, 1 blue, and the last yellow. This will be your goal. Either I or Kurenai will be holding these. All you have to do is ask. But our cage buncheons will be holding these too. The only rule is that you will fail if you take the wrong ribbons. Time limit is the rest of the day. You can use your dog. He looked at Kiba before switching his gaze to Shino. Are your bugs, and then turned to look at Hinata. Are your eyes? Use whatever means you can. Understand? Kiba nodded determinedly while Akamaru yipped above him. It didn't matter that there would be cage buncheons. He would disperse them and, if they didn't, they would be the real ones. This would be easy. Shino inclined his head, silently directing one of his female bugs to land on Haruki's shoulder. The Junin didn't seem to notice. He would be able to find him soon enough. His Kikaichu would only stay on the real one. Hinata nodded meekly, glancing up briefly. She knew Kiba and Shino already had a plan. They always did. But she wondered if they would ask for her help. She had the Byakugan after all. She would be able to tell the difference between the cage buncheons and their real senseis. But, probably not. Just because she had the Byakugan didn't mean that she could use it well enough to help her teammates. Her shoulders slumped. She supposed she would leave this to them then. Haruki eyed all 3 of them. Geez, this was the quietest team he had ever worked with. Even Neji and Sasuke had been more talkative than this lot, with the exception of Kiba. He sighed inwardly. He hoped this exercise would help. He didn't know what else to do. He had spent a lot of time thinking up this plan and had even approached a few other shinobi for help earlier as he had set up the village-wide obstacle course. They had both agreed, eager for something to brighten up the monotone day. All right then. When I say. He glanced meaningfully at Kurenai and the woman blinked in abrupt understanding, tensing subtly and nodding slightly in return. Begin. Kiba blinked when neither Junin moved, Haruki still holding onto the ribbons. Well, he asked impatiently, aren't you going to hide? Haruki shrugged, hefting the ribbons absently. Kurenai tilted her head at them, frowning a little. From his right, Shino suddenly spoke up. These are clones. They are already gone. Kiba glared sullenly at his teammate. How would you know that? Shino nodded at the copy of Haruki. The Kikaichu I placed on Haruki-san's shoulder is no longer there. Thus, this is a cage bunshin. Kiba huffed in irritation when the two in front of them smiled and dispersed, leaving only small puffs of smoke. Fine then. Akamaru. His partner leapt to the ground, nose already twitching. Let's find them, boy. Which way do we go first? Shino frowned, irritation tilting his mouth down behind his collar. Why didn't Kiba ever listen? He should at least hear him out fully. After all, Shino had already noticed the clones. Feeling disgruntled, he headed off on his own, a male Kikaichu flying ahead of him. If Kiba didn't want to listen, then Shino would find the Junin on his own. Hinata glanced uneasily between the two boys. Now what was she supposed to do? Kiba had shot a nasty glare at Shino as the bug user walked off before ignoring him entirely. Should she follow Kiba? Or maybe Shino? Come on, Hinata. Kiba suddenly called out, waving at her. They're this way. Well, Kiba seemed to want her along. Nodding timidly, Hinata hurried after him. Maybe they could meet up with Shino later. XX. I admit, I didn't think this exercise would be very hard for them earlier, but this could get interesting. Kurenai leaned against a tree as they watched several pairs of cage bunshins walk off in different directions. After Haruki explained the plan to her, Kurenai had found herself looking forward to the rest of the day. This exercise would take all three of their skills combined and would help strengthen their tracking skills as well as their teamwork. Could I see some of those seals then? She asked eagerly as they watched the last pair walk off. I've never seen anything that could block the Byakugan. Haruki chuckled but motioned her forward, extending a hand to touch the air. Kurenai gasped in surprise when Kanji flashed into appearance in front of her, glowing with blue chakra. Wait a minute, she murmured, leaning forward. Her eyes widened as she saw wind currents shifting in the air, knotted tightly together with chakra. You drew the seal with wind and chakra. No one does that. No one can. Haruki grinned at her, something like pride shining from that expression. Well, I can. Pretty awesome, right? I can only hold it together for about a day though. Wind is damn hard to control. Kurenai tried not to gape as the seal faded again. A day. She didn't know anyone who could do this for a second, much less a full 24 hours. There was a reason why wind-based ninjutsu was quick and lethal. Shinobi used chakra to shape the wind and throw it at the enemy, but even seasoned ninja couldn't hold it for too long or the attack would injure themselves. Wind was untamable. For Haruki to shape it into a seal and keep it activated with nothing but his own chakra was nothing short of insane. Asuma is going to have a heart attack when he finds out, Kurenai said with feeling. You have amazing control over the wind element. Haruki just smiled at her. Thanks. He glanced distractedly to the right. Shino-kun's coming this way. Oh, that's right. Almost forgot. Kurenai blinked when Haruki created another bunshin before removing a Kikaichu from his shoulder and placing it on the clone instead. Shino always does plan several steps ahead, Kurenai voiced, amused. You're not going to kill it. Haruki frowned thoughtfully as he examined the Kikaichu. There was no way he was going to kill any of the Aburame bugs if he could help it. They had saved his life on more than one occasion. It's her, I think, and no, Shino-kun would be very angry with me. With a nod, he sent the bunshin off and they took to the roofs again. Kikaichu only have a lifespan of a few hours, Kurenai pointed out. She'll die soon anyway. Haruki shrugged. Shino-kun is a bit different, I believe. He cares about his bugs. Kurenai glanced sidelong at her companion. Strange. Haruki seemed so sure. So what now? She asked instead. Sit around and watch. The redhead flopped down on the roof before pulling out 2 paper seals and handing one to her. Here, press this to your clothes. It'll hide scent and chakra signatures until we deactivate them later. Kurenai accepted one, examining it curiously as she pressed it to her clothes. It was a complex seal, one she had never seen before, but then again, she hadn't expected anything less from the man who had removed Anko's cursed seal. XX. Damn it. Is this the real one or the fake? Kiba glared furiously at the redhead in front of him. Haruki had dodged all his kunai, looking more and more amused as time passed, and he still couldn't tell if this was the real one or another clone. He frowned in thought, absently scratching behind one of Akamaru's ears. And then he brightened. Hinata. Kiba whirled on her excitedly, ignoring the way she flinched. Use your Byakugan. You can tell, can't you? Hinata shifted nervously in place. Why yes. Do you want me to check? Kiba nodded vigorously. That'd be great. Hinata took a deep breath and then activated her Kekkei Genkai. Kiba wanted her help. She had to be able to do this. No, he's just a cage bunshin. She trailed off and looked around. What? Thanks, Hinata. Ha, we can totally do this. I'll find all of them and you can check if they're clones or not. Wait. Kiba-kun, Hinata stuttered out, almost forgetting herself as she spun in a circle, bewildered. Kiba frowned, taking a step towards her. Hinata, are you all right? Hinata squinted. What was going on? Why wasn't her Byakugan working? But it worked fine a moment ago. She could tell the clone apart from the real one. I did say that there would be obstacles, the cage bunshin spoke up suddenly. Hinata whirled around again. Pardon. The Haruki lookalike smiled a little. Find the correct route, Hinata-chan. That's the only way you'll be able to find us. Abruptly, the clone dispersed, leaving only a cloud of smoke behind. Hinata. What's he talking about? Hinata blinked at Kiba's confused voice before deactivating her Byakugan. My Byakugan, she murmured. It doesn't work when I'll look in some directions. Her face crumpled miserably. I'm sorry. The hand on her shoulder made her jump. Don't worry. Kiba grinned at her. You heard Haruki-san. You just have to find the correct route. That's a hint. Once you find it, we can go straight to him instead of just wasting time on every cage bunshin. Hinata stared before managing a tremulous smile. Thanks, Kiba-kun. Maybe she wouldn't be too much of a burden after all. XX. Shino stared at the Junin standing in front of him, eyeing his Kikaichu. This was the real one, he was sure. Holding out a hand, he waited for Haruki to hand him the ribbons. Oi, Shino, that ain't him. Instinctively, Shino jerked his hand back and turned to look irritably at his teammate. My Kikaichu is still attached to him. He is the real one. Kiba rolled his eyes as he raced up to his teammate. Why did Shino always have to be so stuck up? Look, he explained impatiently, gesturing at Hinata behind him. Hinata says that's a cage bunshin and she can't be wrong. Haruki-san probably found your bug and moved it. Shino stiffened, glancing at his female teammate. Hinata had her Byakugan activated and was between them anxiously. He pressed his lips together and turned back to the clone. So Haruki had caught on after all. Well, he was a Junin, it wasn't so surprising. He silently summoned the Kikaichu back to him and the cage bunshin smiled before dispersing in a cloud of smoke. Alright then, Akamaru can catch the scent of the next bunshin until Hinata can find her way through the village. Kiba looked at both of them expectantly. Come on then. Shino frowned at the youngest Inuzuka. Just because Kiba had Hinata's help didn't mean his own Kikaichu couldn't do the same thing as Akamaru. I will find my own way, he announced firmly as he sent out his Kikaichu. Hinata watched, wide-eyed as Kiba predictably exploded, yelling at the stoic bug user once again as they moved off to the side. She sighed and glanced up. This was getting old. At the rate they were going, they would definitely fail this mission. But what could she do? They weren't going to listen to her. She could barely hold her own in a spar with either of them and with her Byakugan closed off. Won't you at least try, Hinata-chan? Hinata jumped and spun around, eyes widening when she caught sight of their temporary sensei. Why you're... Haruki chuckled, leaning against a tree on the side of the road. Ah, I'm the real one, but unfortunately, Kurenai has the ribbons right now. Hinata's face fell even as she deactivated her Byakugan. She quickly ducked her head when she caught a glimpse of steady blue eyes studying her. Haruki's gaze made her feel uneasy, as if the Junin could see all her faults and shortcomings. Well, won't you at least try? Hinata flushed, ashamed. God, Haruki must think so little of her. I'm not goody enough, she trailed off, floundering for more words. A thoughtful silence. How do you know? Hinata froze, not sure how to answer. She just knew. She wasn't good enough. Her sister never looked at her with anything but subtle contempt. Her father was always disappointed in her. And her cousin whom she had played with as a child didn't even bother hiding his dislike and scorn for her. Hinata. She jerked up at the stern voice, not quite sure what to expect. Her gaze caught Haruki's again and she found herself unable to drop her eyes this time. Haruki frowned a little as he moved forward to crouch down in front of the Hyuga heiress. Hinata-chan, how do you know you can't if you don't at least try? Wide-eyed and nervous, Hinata opened and closed her mouth several times before whispering, "B because Otu-sama and Neji-ni-sama and Hanabi all think so. And my entire clan thinks so too." Haruki tilted his head, remaining silent for a while longer. The embarrassed flush quickly returned to the kunoichi's cheeks and she made to duck her head again. A startled yelp escaped her when a gentle finger poked her in the forehead. First of all, Haruki smiled at her. "No looking down. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. And you're beautiful. Why would you want to hide your face all the time?" Hinata turned beet red, flushing violently at the Junin's words. She automatically tried to lower her head again but was immediately met with a poke to the forehead once more. Hesitantly, she raised her head a little instead, shifting nervously when Haruki arched an eyebrow. "Now," Haruki continued once the timid girl met his gaze again. "You said that your family all think you can't do anything." At Hinata's nod, Haruki frowned again, leaning forward a little to peer more closely at her. "And what if they're all wrong?" Hinata jerked, staring wide-eyed at the red-haired Junin as she gaped at him. They see can't be wrong," she stammered out, twisting the hem of her jacket. I'm. Hinata-chan," Haruki interrupted, choosing his next words carefully. "The only way they can be right is if you believe they are." Hinata fell silent, hands frozen in motion as Haruki's words replayed themselves in her head. Haruki inwardly sighed. God, this was hard. He was much more used to the quiet but confident woman Hinata would eventually grow up into. "It's easy, Hinata-chan," Haruki continued patiently. "There's only one thing you have to decide. Do you want them to be right?" Hinata instantly shook her head before she could stop herself. Flushing again, she just managed to remember not to look down and felt a stir of warmth in her chest as Haruki smiled his approval. "Well then," Haruki reached out to gently untangle her fingers from her jacket. "I don't see the problem. If you don't want them be right, then prove them wrong." Hinata deflated. I can't. Try." Haruki cut in again. "You never know until you try. And you just keep trying until you get it right. Besides, what do they know? Who can possibly know you better than you know yourself? Your thoughts, your feelings, your insecurities, your dreams. No one can possibly know those things better than you. And anyone can do anything as long as they never give up." Hinata stared at the man in front of her, not quite sure how to react. No one had ever said these things to her, as if they thought she could do it. As if they believed in her. A tear slipped unbidden down her cheek and she quickly reached up to scrub it away. She didn't want Haruki to see her crying, but, checking his expression, all he did was continue smiling back at her. Her father would have disapproved. They both glanced up as Kiba's voice rose again, loud even at this distance. Hinata sometimes wondered how her teammates managed to stay alive in each other's presence. "They're both far too proud," Haruki commented mildly as he stood up again. He glanced down at the Hyuga heiress beside him. "That's where you come in, you know. You're their bridge." Hinata frowned, feeling confused. Bridge. She made sure to keep her head up instead of glancing down. Somehow, she felt herself relaxing in this Junin's presence. Haruki nodded. "Well, as you can see, those two definitely aren't going to become friends by themselves anytime soon. Someone's got to pull them together. But I don't know if they'll listen to me." Hinata glanced anxiously at her teammates again. Haruki chuckled, slipping his hands into his coat as he rocked back on his heels. "Every team's like that, Hinata-chan." Noting her quizzical expression, Haruki clarified, "Your cousin's team is like that. Neji-kun and Lee-kun are as different as night and day. Tenten's the one who keeps both of them grounded and tied to the team." Hinata blinked, thinking back to the few times she had glimpsed her cousin during one of his training sessions. The green-clad teammate of his was a bit different. But the female kunoichi did seem more level-headed and Hinata had even caught her lecturing Neji once. What about Naruto-kun's? She trailed off, blushing furiously. Haruki held back a smile. Hinata did have a crush on him back in the day, didn't she? And being the clueless idiot he had been, he had completely missed the Hyuga heiress affections, but perhaps that was best. Things had turned out fine in the future and Hinata had found her own love in the end. Naruto's team is just as bad. Probably worse, Haruki told her cheerfully. He and Sasuke are similar and different in so many ways. Those two fight all the time. If it wasn't for Sakura, they'd be at each other's throats every 5 minutes. Half the time, I'm surprised Sakura doesn't go insane having to deal with those two all the time. An unexpected giggle slipped out and Hinata quickly clapped a hand over her mouth. But Haruki only laughed softly, one hand giving her a soft pat on the shoulder. Don't worry. Laugh at them all you want. Those two are a comedy show all on their own. This time, the giggles came more freely and Hinata found herself smiling openly for the first time in a long while. She hesitated for a moment, glancing between the boys and her temporary sensei before asking shyly, what do you think I should do? About them. Haruki hemmed thoughtfully, inwardly dancing on the inside. Well, you could try yelling at them. He grinned at the horrified expression on Hinata's face. Hey, it would definitely work. You could shock them into compliance. But I suppose that's not your style. He paused, glancing down at the kunoichi again. What do you think you should be doing right now? Hinata looked around nervously before activating her Byakugan and scanning their surroundings again. She had caught a glimpse of something that looked like a path and she concentrated in that direction now. Yes, she could still see it. There was nothing blocking her Byakugan this time and she could see right through the buildings blocking her way. Deactivating her Byakugan again, she glanced brightly up at Haruki, forgetting her reticence as she piped up excitedly, I found it. I can see the way. Haruki quirked a smile at her as he nodded. Okay then. You're already one up your teammates. Now you just have to get them to listen. He reached out to give the Hyuga heiress a gentle push forward when she remained frozen in place. You're constantly changing at your own pace and you're fine just the way you are. What you want to become, what you want to prove, you already have the strength to do both. All you have to do is find it in yourself and take the leap. Now go on. Show them what you can do, Hinata-chan. Hinata watched as the Junin gave her a last smile before melting into a nearby alleyway, a mixture of hope and disbelief forming a hard lump in her throat. That was the first time anyone had ever told her she could do something. But what could Haruki see in her? She turned back to stare at her teammates, one still shouting, the other doing his best to ignore him. You're constantly changing at your own pace and you're fine just the way you are. What you want to become, what you want to prove, you already have the strength to do both. All you have to do is find it in yourself and take the leap. Hinata pressed her lips together before straightening her shoulders. She didn't want to stay like this forever. She wanted to get stronger. And if she already had the potential to do that, then the only thing stopping her right now was herself. Taking a deep breath, Hinata marched forward, coming to a stop just a few steps behind her two teammates. Kiba Kuna. She frowned when her voice came out barely above a murmur. That wouldn't do. If she wanted them to listen to her, then she'd have to speak up. She winced when Kiba reached out to grab Shino. That probably wouldn't be a good idea. Kiba-kun. Shino-kun. Stop fighting. Her voice almost cracked at the end, but Hinata determinedly held the volume until the very last word. To her shock, both boys froze, heads snapping in her direction with shock evident on even Shino's face. She flushed but kept her head up defiantly when she remembered Haruki's words. I found the path Haruki-san left for us. Hinata forced the stammer out of her words as much as she could. Shino-kun, Haruki-san gave us this mission as a team. I think it would be best to stick together. Kiba-kun, don't get mad at everything Shino-kun does. You both specialize in tracking. You have your way and Shino-kun has his. Wouldn't we finish this mission even faster if you two work together? Hinata felt her clenched hands tremble just a little by the end of her monologue. She had never spoken so much at one time. Actually, she was pretty sure she had never spoken so much in a day. Both her teammates were staring at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head and Hinata fought the urge to shrink away and look down, staring resolutely back at the boys. Surprisingly, Shino was the first to capitulate, shoulders suddenly losing their tensed slant and his entire countenance regaining their previous stoicism. If you have found the path Haruki-san designated for us, Shino muttered, then it is logical to stay together. Kiba couldn't quite tear his eyes off his female teammate. What the heck had happened to Hinata? Where was the shy, timid girl he knew as his teammate? At the moment, all he could see was a subtle ferocity in Hinata's face, almost daring him to argue with her. He managed, rubbing the back of his neck as his expression turned sheepish. Well, if you know which way to go, then staying together sounds good. Hinata brightened visibly. They listened to her. Was this all she had to do? Give them something important enough that they would see the value of sticking together as a team. Oh, okay then, she stammered out when she noticed that both boys' attentions were still glued on her. Let's go this way. I think we're heading towards the versus village's gates. Hinata turned and began walking, stamping down the urge to check if they would follow. She found herself smiling when she heard the shuffle of footsteps fall into step behind her. Maybe she could do something if she tried. XXX. Asuma was right. You're great with children. Haruki snorted, perched at the edge of a rooftop. Kurenai, it was touch and go for a while there. I'm not used to talking to girls like Hinata. Until the last moment, I still hadn't decided how I was going to get through to her. Kurenai blinked, leaning forward curiously. Undecided. What would you have done instead if not that? Haruki shrugged before grinning wryly. Got her mad. Insulted her until she got pissed enough to yell back at me. Haruki raised his hands in a placating gesture at the appalled look on the kunoichi's face. Hey, don't look at me like that. I know people that just won't respond unless I piss them off. Like Anko, Kurenai shot back huffily. Not Hinata. I would have punched you if you had picked that method. The redhead rubbed the back of his head awkwardly. Good thing I didn't then, huh? Kurenai just rolled her eyes before nodding at her students. Let's go then. They're almost at the gates. XXX. Katetsu perked up from his slumped position at the wooden desk when he caught sight of three distant figures making their way toward them. Hey, they're coming. Azumo rolled his eyes but couldn't help straightening up as well. Gate duty was damn boring when there wasn't anything going on and damn annoying when there was. Either way, it wasn't the best job in the world. You think they'll ask us? Katetsu leaned forward impatiently, peering at the approaching genin. Maybe we should give them a hint. Azumo couldn't suppress an exasperated sigh as he reached out and yanked his partner back into his seat. Would you stop that? With the way you're acting, you might as well be waving a red flag at them. Besides, Haruki said they'd get it. We're supposed to give them the hint after they come to us, not give them a hint to get the real hint. Katetsu huffed but settled back down in his chair. He had been bored all morning and it was already nearing midday. There hadn't been so much as an ant crossing into Konoha. No one could blame him for being a little excited. When Haruki had approached them at 6:30 this morning looking like death warmed over, they had immediately inquired after his health. The redhead had assured them that he was fine and had just had a late night, looking almost puzzled at their concern. The two of them had been hard-pressed not to call Yugo up immediately and have the woman drag Haruki to the hospital. The man looked like Hayate on a bad day. But before they could make up their minds, Haruki had launched into a brief explanation of the training exercise he had in mind for Kurenai's genin team and had asked them if they wanted to help. Neither of them needed any time to think on it and agreed immediately. The makeshift mission sounded entertaining and would make their day more interesting. Genins are kinda slow, Katetsu commented in a low voice and Azumo held back the urge to whack him over the head. They're just starting, he whispered back. What did you expect? Katetsu shuffled his feet as he watched the group draw closer. They could at least walk faster. And how exactly was that dog supposed to pick up on all the chakra threads if it was sitting on top of the boy's head? And he couldn't see a single kikaichu flying around either. He squinted at them and willed them to walk faster. They stopped and looked around. Katetsu twitched and growled, damn, they're either not that bright or, well, not that bright. An elbow in his ribs made him grunt. Azumo glared irately at his partner. If you don't shut up, I'm going to knock you out and do our part by myself. His voice bordering on a whine, Katetsu retorted, come on, Zumo. We could have done this when we were genin. Azumo gave him a pointed look. You sucked at sensing chakra signatures. How would you have found the chakra threads? Katetsu grinned at his partner. You were amazing at sensing chakra. I'd just ask you. Anyway, Kurenai's team have an Aburame and an Inuzuka, plus the Hyuga. They should be rushing through this with no problem. Azumo just heaved another sigh but didn't bother arguing back. Prolonged arguments with Katetsu usually resulted in headaches. The man just didn't give. Hey, they're moving again. They're coming this way. Act normal. Azumo could feel a tic developing over one eye as he tried not to slam his head into the wooden table. Aboard Katetsu was a stupid and mildly hyperactive Katetsu. He aimed a kick at his partner's shin. Settle down. He snapped as best he could without raising his voice. If anyone needs to look normal, it's you. Calm down, idiot. Azumo turned to glance at the genin as Katetsu obeyed somewhat reluctantly and settled back again, shifting occasionally in his seat. He glanced down at one hand and flexed it. He was no puppeteer and sending out chakra threads wasn't something he did on a regular basis, but it was challenging enough to be fun. Maybe he would try to lead them astray. Haruki had said they could do anything they want. The trail ends here. Hinata stopped to look around. The main gates loomed in front of them but there wasn't anything eye-catching within sight. Shino glanced around, noting the two chunin on gate duty. He frowned. One of them looked excited. Silently, he directed his bugs out. They were back within seconds, relaying their conversation to him. He took a step towards the two shinobi before stopping to consider his options. And then, with a mental sigh, he turned back to his two teammates. My Kikaichu say that those two chunin are part of this mission. They will direct us to our next destination. Kiba's jaw dropped open, blinking in surprise at his teammate. Did Shino just offer up information of his own free will? Hinata smiled timidly at the older boy. Thanks for telling us, Shino-kun. I guess we should go ask them. Kiba closed his mouth with a click and offered a wary grin at the bug user. Alright then. Let's go see what they know. A minute later, they were assembled in front of the two suddenly bored-looking shinobi, and like always, Kiba spoke up first, bounding up to the wooden desk with his usual enthusiasm. Hi. Did Haruki-san, Junin, red hair, blue eyes, did he come by? The two chunin exchanged a disinterested glance. Or at least tried to. The one on the left suddenly made a face and broke out into a grin. Okay. I can't do this, he announced as the chunin on the right face palmed. Come on Zumo, what am I supposed to do? I can't treat a bunch of genin like they're foreign nin come to visit. The shinobi on the right snapped, looking annoyed, no one told you to. We're supposed to pretend we don't know anything until they give us enough proof that they know what they're doing. The first chunin shrugged and turned back to them. They asked about Haruki. That's good enough for me. Now let's get started. The second chunin sighed and gave up, casting a critical eye over them. Kiba exchanged bemused expressions with his fellow teammates. What could these two possibly tell them? Couldn't they just point them in the right direction? Alright then, here's the deal. Katetsu stood up and came out from the station. Azumo, that's him by the way, and I'm Katetsu. We're going to send out chakra threads toward certain parts of the village. Your job is to follow the right thread to find Haruki. And Kurenai, I suppose. Understand. Azumo frowned over at his partner as he also stood up. I seem to recall longer instructions, Katetsu. He turned back to the genin. There will be 2 correct threads among 20. One will lead you straight to them while the other will lead you back to us eventually and then you'll be able to follow the other one to find them. The 2 correct threads will have the most amount of chakra put into it. Any questions? All 3 genin shook their heads. Katetsu and Azumo exchanged a glance before turning simultaneously towards the rest of the village, spread their hands, and shot out a web of chakra threads, the shimmering blue almost glinting under the midday sun. Azumo frowned in concentration, mentally ticking off the list of places Haruki had given him as he directed his threads to different parts of the village. Well, this wasn't too bad. So long as the genin didn't take too long, he could probably keep this up for a few hours. Although, he twitched a finger to extend one last thread, reducing the chakra output by about 1/10, towards Shushuya. He figured it took Suna Nin quite a while to become puppet masters. Katetsu inwardly made a face as he controlled the chakra regulation in his threads. This was harder than he thought it would be. But, he thought as he tagged the side wall of Ichiraku Ramen with a thread, it was also just as much fun as he had thought it would be. Guiding the threads through the twists and turns of the village any way he wanted was good practice, and it would be interesting to see what these genin could do when he adjusted the chakra level of some of the threads. Alright. Kiba turned to Hinata. Hinata, just find the right threads and leave the rest to Akamaru. He paused, glancing hesitantly at his other teammate before adding grudgingly, and Shino's bugs can help too. Hinata nodded and activated her Byakugan, and then almost reeled when she saw the village open before her. Haruki-san took down the barriers. She stared in surprise. Kiba glanced between her and the village. Really? So you can see through stuff again? Hinata nodded happily before her face fell a little. But I can't see that far. Kiba shrugged nonchalantly. Who cares? You can work on that from now on and it'll get better, right? Hinata smiled tentatively at that as she nodded. Turning her Byakugan to the chakra threads, she frowned closely at the strings, quickly ruling out 9 of them. She glanced nervously at the 2 chunin and quietly pointed them out. The shinobi exchanged an amused look before releasing them, leaving 11 behind. This time, Hinata had to peer more closely at the threads, ruling out 2 more before becoming stumped. The last 9 looked identical. She glanced uncertainly back at her teammates and Kiba promptly bounded forward. Alright, let's each take a path and follow it. Whoever finds them first can use a bunshin to send for the others, okay? Hinata nodded and Shino inclined his head before all 3 set off. The threads faded in color as they drew farther away from the 2 chunin, but Akamaru had already jumped to the ground to lead Kiba. Shino had his bugs spread out in front of him, and Hinata quickly followed the trail with her eyes. Behind them, Katetsu and Azumo smirked. Haruki had said they could do anything they wanted to the incorrect strings and none of them had picked the right one. Without a word, they adjusted the threads so that they ran through alleyways and down streets, looping around the buildings to lead the genin in useless circles. Wonder how long it'll take for them to catch on. Katetsu settled on the ground, transferring his remaining 4 strings to his right hand and withdrawing a kunai with his left to draw idle doodles on the ground. Azumo rolled his eyes but sat down as well. They made a rather strange sight. He was glad Anko wasn't around to laugh at them as they sat in front of the entrance gates with chakra threads attached to their hands. Then again, she could just as easily want to join in. It was always hard to tell her. XX. 3 hours later, they were both twitching. God, how long are they going to take? Katetsu flopped back on the ground, ignoring the fact that it shook the 2 remaining chakra threads attached to his fingers. Damn, he was starving. Azumo tried not to scowl and reminded himself that they were only genin. Seeing as he had been telling himself that for the past 2 hours, it wasn't working very well. He transferred the 3 threads from one hand to the other. By some sort of bad luck, all 3 genin had managed to pick every thread except the 2 that they needed. He and Katetsu had played with them for a while, adjusting the threads so that they led the students in circles. But seriously, how much longer were they going to take? Hungry. An amused voice sounded from beside them and they turned to see Haruki and Kurenai approaching, weighed down with boxes of food. Our saviors. Katetsu cheered, shooting up again as he accepted a box from Haruki. Ooh. Yakisoba. Thanks. Azumo grinned a thanks up at the 2 junin as well before digging in. You really should have come earlier, he commented reproachfully. I had to listen to Tetsu moan about his stomach. Katetsu shot him a scowl as he swallowed a big mouthful. Hey, you were just as hungry as I was. Don't put this all on me. Haruki exchanged an amused smile with Kurenai. These 2 were always good for a few laughs. Hey, are your students doing anyway? Azumo inquired. Kurenai shrugged gracefully. They're following the trails well enough. Shino's been the quickest to figure out that his strings are just misleads. Kiba's the slowest. Hey, we played with them for a bit, Katetsu remarked with a grin. We can't extend chakra strings through the entire village, so we just keep looping back. Needless to say, it's been working. They all glanced up as they sensed Kiba's chakra signature storming towards them and Shino and Hinata not far behind. Ah. Haruki straightened. We better get going. Thanks for the help, you two. The two Chunin waved their chopsticks in the air. No problem. It was pretty fun. Come back anytime. And remember to buy lunch for us again. Haruki chuckled and waved a hand behind him before shining away, Kurenai a few steps behind him. XX. We found you. Haruki and Kurenai turned from their spots on the Hokage monument, legs dangling over the edge. They both held back smiles as Kiba stormed up to them, expression thunderous and looking dusty and exhausted. Akamaru was resting on top of Kiba's head, obviously dozing, and Shino and Hinata didn't look to be faring much better. The Aburame heir was as stoic as ever, but there was a tired air around him as he came up to them. The Hyuga heiress was panting, her Byakugan deactivated as she half stumbled towards them as well. Haruki smiled and stood up. Congratulations. We just talked with Katetsu and Azumo a few minutes before you followed the last string. You've gotten faster. Kiba scowled and glared suspiciously at the ribbons, sniffing at them. All right, they're the right ones. Now I can rest. He flopped to the ground, reclining back on his hands. Kurenai chuckled and rose to her feet as well, smiling at her students. Hinata had somehow managed to pull them together, though she suspected that there was still something unresolved between Kiba and Shino. Good job, she said instead. I didn't expect you to get here so quickly after returning to Katetsu and Azumo again. Despite his fatigue, Kiba grinned up at her. Akamaru's the best. He can find anyone quickly once he gets a lead. A near-invisible frown marred Shino's brow as his irritation from the long mission and Kiba's usual antics came to a breaking point, and he remarked sharply, my Kikaichu helped as well. If it were not for them, your dog would not have been as fast. Kiba was immediately on his feet, almost dislodging Akamaru. Hey, don't insult Akamaru. His temper flared as Kurenai tried to calm him down. He's an Inuzuka dog. We're the best trackers in the world. Shino's voice was tight with tension as he retorted flatly, Kikaichu are less noticeable. They are obviously better trackers. Akamaru got confused when two chakra threads crossed each other. If you were older, perhaps you two would have been able to tell the diff. Kiba cut in, eyes glaring as he snarled, we're getting better every day. And Akamaru's the best partner anyone could have, and I'm not weak, so just shut up. And then, without a backwards glance, the Inuzuka rushed off, shoving roughly past both of them as he descended the Hokage monument again. Kurenai stared at her team, wondering how things had gone downhill so quickly. Why would Kiba snap like that? Granted, he was more tired than usual, but Shino's first remark hadn't been very out of character. It was along the same things the bug user always said. Hinata stared between Shino and Kiba, unsure of how to proceed. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts and she turned to look at Haruki. Could you go after him, Hinata-chan? Haruki hadn't moved from his spot and he waited for Hinata to nod and, throwing one last worried glance at the motionless Aburame, hurry after Kiba. He glanced at Kurenai and tilted his head at Shino. The kunoichi seemed to understand because she nodded after a moment and, reaching out to pat Shino's shoulder as she passed, took off after her other two students. Haruki waited until the others were out of sight before letting his gaze slide over to Shino. For once, the bug user looked almost unsettled, shifting subtly on the spot as his Kikaichu, sensing his anxiety, stirred beneath his coat. Shino-kun, Haruki finally called out softly as he dropped back down to sit at the edge. Indulge me and come sit with me for a bit, please. A long moment of silence resounded around them, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind. And then there was a shuffle of footsteps and the Aburame heir carefully sat down on the ledge as well, leaving a good 2 feet between them. Haruki remained quiet, staring out over the village as he waited for Shino to speak. From long experience, he knew that the bug user would only talk when he was good and ready and no amount of prodding would get him to do otherwise. The fact that Shino had chosen to sit next to him instead of simply walking away meant that he was actually willing to talk. I did not mean it that way, Shino finally said, hands stuffed deep in his coat as sat stiffly beside the red-haired Junin. He wasn't quite sure why he was even sitting there really, but his feet had brought him over to Haruki, so there he was. Kiba as always. He trailed off, not knowing how to describe his teammate without insulting him too badly. Touchy. The Junin beside him offered, a tinge of hollow amusement in his voice. You could say that he has reason to be. Shino glanced over at Haruki out of the corner of his eye. What did that mean? But the Junin didn't expand any further, instead continuing with a completely different line of conversation. What did you think of the exercise today? Shino frowned, absently tapping a heel against the Yondaime's hair. An amused snicker made him glance to the side again, only to find Haruki staring at his foot with a private smile glinting in his eyes. Abruptly, he stilled his foot even as Haruki turned his gaze back to the village again. It was different, Shino revealed. Kurenai-sensei has never done something like that with us. Why, you ask? Because Abarames and Inazukas and even Hyugas are natural trackers. Our skills are honed with age. He paused for a moment, considering the difficulty he had had. It was easier with Hinata and Kiba, he admitted at last. It would have taken much longer if I had had to do it alone. Haruki smiled. Ma, that's what teammates are for. So you don't have to carry your burdens alone. It takes a while for teams to click. Some teams fall together immediately, like Shikamaru-kun, Ino-chan, and Choji-kun. Other teams have a lot of infighting, but they pull together when it really counts, like Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. Then there are teams like yours, the redhead glanced down at Shino, who don't really mesh until you get the opportunity to understand each other. Shino's frown deepened, but he remained silent. He still wasn't sure he understood. Was it hard? Haruki asked, going off on another tangent again. Sending out your bugs to retrieve information and all. Shino glanced suspiciously at the Junin before inclining his head cautiously. It was time-consuming, especially in places where my bugs have not been yet. He hesitated before continuing. I have been working on a new jutsu, but it is not going well. Oh. Haruki looked over. Maybe I could help. What's the jutsu? Shino silently pressed a hand against the ground, muttering, Haijutsu, Mushios. A faint web of chakra extended from his hand, but it stuttered to a stop about a meter away. Lips pressed together in frustration, Shino withdrew his chakra and turned back to the village. Haruki hemmed thoughtfully before extending his own hand. Well, why don't you try making chakra threads, like Katetsu and Azumo today? Shino blinked as blue threads shot from the Junin's fingers and attached itself to a nearby rock. With a subtle twitch, the string yanked the rock off the ground and Haruki caught it neatly as it flew through the air. How did you? He leaned forward before catching himself. But Haruki only grinned, dropping the rock and reaching for his own hand. Shino hesitated. He usually didn't like anyone touching him. His Kikaichu sometimes didn't move fast enough and would get crushed in the few times someone did. But to his surprise, Haruki made sure to circle his fingers only around his hand and not above his wrist, gently extending his fingers. First of all, concentrate a controlled point of chakra to your fingers. Try your index to begin. And then just imagine pushing your chakra out in a controlled way, only through that finger. Try it. Shino silently did as he was told, eyes narrowing in concentration as he released the chakra. To his alarm, a burst of chakra poured out of his hand, jerking him backwards and shaking a few Kikaichu loose from where they were resting under his coat. The Kikaichu instinctively flew towards the small explosion of chakra and Shino instinctively opened his mouth to cry out a warning. Two hands suddenly shot out and caught the three Kikaichu in cupped hands, drawing them away from the fading burst of energy and returning them to his coat. Wide-eyed, Shino stared at the very much alive bugs fluttering lazily on his sleeve. Shino-kun. Shino jerked up to stare at the Junin. Are they all right? Sorry. I guess I should have warned you that that might happen. Haruki reached up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind one ear and Shino caught the reddened skin on the back of one hand. You are hurt, he stated, somewhat stupidly, he thought. Of course the Junin knew he was hurt. Chakra burns stung. Haruki glanced down at his hand. He had barely noticed. Don't worry, he reassured the genin. I've had much worse. This will go away soon enough. Are your bugs all right? Shino nodded, letting the Kikaichu crawl back under his coat. You did not have to save them, he said after a moment, not really sure where he was going with this, only knowing that the brief flare of panic in his stomach had faded when Haruki had saved his bugs. They would have died in a few hours. Haruki only smiled warmly down at him. Yes, but they're important to you, aren't they? No matter how unimportant something may seem to others, if it's important to you, then you have to protect it at all costs. You're my student, at least for today, so is your sensei. What's important to you is important to me. Besides, I know how important Kikaichu are. Konoha's lucky to have them. Shino stared some more, finding himself completely out of his depth. He wanted to say, thank you, or do something to show his gratitude for the Junin for doing something so seemingly insignificant, but he couldn't quite get the words out and, in the end, simply extended a hand again. Show me again, please. Shino found himself unsurprised when Haruki simply nodded and took his hand again. They worked on producing chakra threads for several more minutes until Shino could extend a weak thread of chakra outwards. It wouldn't attach to anything, but Haruki assured him that simply creating them was the first step. Now, the Junin continued briskly. Try doing your jutsu again. Shino nodded and placed his hand on the ground again. To his surprise, the web seemed to spread from his hand more easily, extending a good 2.5 meters before stopping again. He glanced up questioningly at Haruki. A web is easier to create than singular threads, the redhead explained. Chakra threads are more concentrated, so if you can do that, a web should come much easier. Shino nodded again and this time managed a quiet, thank you. Haruki smiled before reaching into a pocket and withdrawing a green ribbon. Your prize for successfully completing the mission today, he announced cheerfully, extending the thin strip of cloth towards him. Shino blinked as he accepted it, not quite sure what he was supposed to do with it. His hand stilled as he caught sight of the design, small and meticulously depicted, on the surface of one end of the ribbon. It was a Kikaichu. The detail was amazing. Looking closely, Shino could pick out the faint lines on his clan's bug's wings, sewn on the forest green cloth in silver thread. Only the eyes were a different shade, an emerald green that almost seemed to shine under the afternoon sunlight. Abarames were quiet because they wanted to be, not because they couldn't find words to express themselves, but for once, Shino found himself at a loss for words. When I was young, Haruki said beside him, voice measured. I lived alone. I had to learn to do a lot of things most of the other kids didn't, and sewing was one of them. Had to fix my own clothes, you see, so I'm pretty good at that. An almost self-conscious pause. Do you like it? Right away. Shino nodded, clutching the ribbon tightly in one hand. Again, he managed a soft, thank you, before carefully tucking the ribbon away in his pocket. He would carry it with him from now on, perhaps for good luck. Listen to those around you, Shino-kun, Haruki's voice made him look up again. Not just to what they say but also to what they don't say. And look at those around you too, not just at what they show you, but what you can see when you really look at them. Shino considered the words, still not quite understanding. He glanced up at the redhead and tilted his head in question. Haruki nodded decisively back at him before clambering to his feet, tugging at his coat. Alright, come on. Kiba's probably gotten into trouble by now. He always likes to pick fights when he's angry. I think you'll see something interesting if we hurry. Mystified, Shino rose to his feet as well, trotting after the Junin without a second thought. XX. 5 minutes later, Shino stood in the shadows of an alleyway, staring with a strange mix of consternation and anger at the altercation playing out before him. Runt of the litter is a bit far from home, isn't he? One Chunin jeered. Kiba glared furiously back at them, fists clenched as Akamaru growled on top of his head. Behind him, Hinata stood frozen to the spot, looking shocked and uncertain, but a rising flush of anger colored her cheeks. Shut the hell up. I'm going to be clan head one day. I'll be the strongest shinobi in Konoha. The trio of Chunin scoffed. That's what you always say, but how are you gonna do that if you never get stronger? Besides, everyone knows Hana's going to be the next Inuzuka head. At least she's strong. All you ever do is fail at school and skip out on training to play with that pathetic excuse of a dog. Little boys shouldn't play at being shinobi. Don't insult Akamaru. Kiba yelled, and Shino inwardly winced at the familiar words. He's gonna become the greatest Inuzuka dog in the clan. The Chunin near the front laughed, loud and mocking. Yeah, what's he gonna do? Woof someone to death. The teen took a step forward and Akamaru immediately leapt to the ground, young voice yipping madly as his hackles raised. This only made the Chunin laugh harder even as one aimed a kick at the dog. Kiba lunged forward and managed to drag his partner back just in time. Do you understand now? Shino-kun. Haruki's voice sounded above Shino and he nodded woodenly, a funny ringing in his ears when the Chunin made for his teammate again. Well, a gentle push to his shoulder propelled him forward. He's your teammate, isn't he? Perhaps even a rival and maybe a friend one day. What are you waiting for? That was all the prompting Shino needed, and a silent command to his Kikaichu had them shooting towards the jeering teens with single-minded intensity. Kiba pulled back, still clinging onto a growling Akamaru, when a cloud of bugs swarmed the Chunin in front of him, dissolving their laughter to shrieks of alarm. Seconds later, they were scrambling away, chased down the streets by the Aburame clan's signature partners. Slowly, Kiba rose to his feet, blinking bewilderedly as his other teammate stepped from the shadows of an alleyway. They stared at each other for a long moment, but surprisingly, it was Shino who spoke first. I apologize, the Aburame heir said clearly. I did not mean what I said on the Hokage monument. I was only tired and took it out on you. Kiba stared wide-eyed at the bug user, opening his mouth to say something back only to find himself gaping. That's all right, he finally spluttered, surprised to find that he meant it. I'm sorry too. I said some pretty bad things as well. Not just today. A stilted silence fell between them and Kiba concentrated on patting Akamaru. This was really weird. Usually, he and Shino just didn't get along, but, well, this side of Shino he could live with. And he had defended him. Thanks, he said awkwardly, gesturing in the direction that the Chunin had ran off in. I appreciate it. Shino nodded once and the silence this time wasn't as bad. They both glanced at Hinata when a soft giggle was heard. Sorry, she stammered out, hands clasped together. But why you two can actually get along pretty well when you both try. Kiba turned back to Shino, a little bemused at the change in team dynamics. They were completely different this morning. A throat clearing drew their attention to their sensei and they all straightened when Kurenai approached them, a broad smile that spoke of pride directed at them. She didn't say anything though, as if any words mentioned about their tentative camaraderie might ruin it. Behind her, Haruki followed at a more sedate pace, hands comfortably stuck in his coat. Feeling suddenly embarrassed, Kiba glanced down again, crouching to pick up Akamaru. Sheesh, he grumbled half-heartedly. You're always jumping out at people way bigger than you. Why are you always doing that? Can't you use your head first before you go rushing in? Soft laughter snapped his gaze back up and he frowned at the red-haired Junin as the man approached. Haruki quirked an eyebrow at him, mouth curved in a gentle smile. You should know, Kiba. Dogs aren't like humans, no matter how intelligent they are. They don't need a reason to protect their important people. He glanced down at the white puppy. Right, Akamaru. Akamaru yipped in agreement, tail wagging. Kiba stared in shock at Haruki before blinking down at his partner. Not many people talked directly to his dog, as if Akamaru couldn't understand. A rustle drew his attention back to the Junin and his jaw dropped when Haruki pulled out a bag of Inuzuka dog treats. Where did you? Haruki grinned a little as he withdrew a treat. Akamaru's ears suddenly perked up. Your sister sold it to me earlier this morning. May I? Oh, yeah, sure. Akamaru was already wagging like crazy and he snapped up the two treats that were offered at once, yipping a thank you, and a they're delicious afterwards before jumping towards Haruki, settling into the arms that automatically came out to catch him. Kiba watched, astonished when Haruki chuckled and replied, You're welcome. And I wouldn't know, but I'm glad you like them. You can understand him. Haruki shrugged, shaking his head as he put away the treats before passing Akamaru back. No, but I can guess. I've spent time around a few dogs over the years. Without waiting for a reply, he withdrew a blue and a yellow ribbon next, offering the yellow one to Kiba and the blue one to Hinata. Kiba examined it curiously as Akamaru clambered back up onto his head to get a better view. Hey, that's Akamaru. And it was. The depiction of his partner and best friend was sewn in white and brown thread against the sunshine golden yellow of the ribbon, and even as small as it was, the figure was clearly standing guard over something, jaws opened as if barking and tail flaring behind him. Thanks, Haruki-san. Kiba openly beamed up at Haruki, grinning happily as he showed it to Akamaru. Haruki only gazed back almost solemnly. You did well today. Regardless of what other people say, if you think you can do it, then show everyone else what you and Akamaru can do. Become the best Inuzuka combo to ever come out of Konoha. Kiba stilled, hand clenched around the ribbon. Haruki hadn't told him to train harder, like his mother, or study more, like his sister, simply do. Show me you can do it. Show the world you can do it. He looked back up, gaze firmer this time and nodded sharply, once. Being one of the strongest shinobi with Akamaru beside him had always been what he wanted. If he tried hard enough, if he didn't give up. He glanced up at his partner. They could do it, and they'd show those who called them runts just who were better. Hinata-chan, something wrong. Haruki turned to the Hyuga heiress who was looking mildly confused as she stared down at her ribbon. Why a tiger? Hinata asked timidly. She had always liked the magnificent cats but surely one wouldn't fit her. Haruki smiled, a tinge of wistfulness entering his expression. One day, Hinata would sign a summoning contract with tigers, and he couldn't say any other animal suited the Hyuga heiress more than the majestic animals. Tigers symbolize courage, Hinata-chan. Haruki chuckled at the blush that rose in the girl's face. They also represent improvement and change, triumphs in the impossible, and above all else, freedom. Don't let anyone or anything hold you back, Hinata-chan, and that includes yourself. You'll become far greater than you could ever imagine. All you have to do is let yourself do that. Hinata was wide-eyed and blushing when Haruki stopped, but she didn't hesitate to nod this time, and she carefully wrapped the indigo ribbon with the flame orange and black tiger design around her wrist, carefully tucking the ends away. She would carry it with her, as a reminder of what Haruki had taught her today. All right then. Haruki took a step back and glanced briefly at a bemused-looking Kurenai. I've gone on long enough. Thanks for going along with my tedious mission. All three of you have done really well today. I was impressed with the way you clicked together once you actually started trying to work as a team. But I'm sure you've had enough of me for one day, so I guess I'll just let Kurenai take over now. Kurenai quirked an eyebrow at him but stepped up with a warm smile. Great job today, everyone. Your teamwork's improved quite a bit, and I've spotted some areas in your tracking skills that could use some work, so we'll start on that tomorrow. Training is at the same time in the morning, so get a good night's rest, okay? All three genin nodded obediently and it wasn't long before Kurenai and Hinata departed first. Kurenai brushed by Haruki, thanking him warmly for the training session though her eyes thanked him for a much deeper reason. He had pulled her team together for her, something she wasn't sure she would have managed for at least a few months more. Of course, the dynamics still needed work and Kiba and Shino would no doubt get into another fight sooner or later, but something between the boys had disappeared, and Hinata now looked at her and gnawed at the ground. Hinata left next, needing to be home before her sparring session with Hanabi started. She would try harder this time. Her sister couldn't look up to her if she was always looking down. She thanked Haruki shyly and the Junin smiled back at her, friendly and warm and entirely focused on her. She left the practice with an almost skip in her step. Haruki stared with some puzzlement at the last two of Team 8, not quite sure what they wanted. They glanced at each other and then seemed to come to some sort of silent agreement. Haruki-san, would you be free for a couple minutes tomorrow, sometime around 6? Kiba asked eagerly. It's just that our parents, my mum and Shino's dad, are coming home and I want my mum to meet you. No one's ever actually took the time to listen to Akamaru before and she'd be interested to see you. She can be a bit scary though, and she's impatient and gets angry easily and really tough. Haruki's sweat dropped. Yeah, that sounded a lot like the Sum he knew. Should I be worried? Kiba rubbed the back of head. Nah. Ka-chan's great once you get to know her and she can be all those things but I love her anyway, ya know. He ducked his head, hiding the embarrassed red as it rose in his face. Haruki chuckled but nodded. I get it. He turned to Shino. And you'd like me to meet your dad too? Shino inclined his head. You treat Kikaichu very differently than most people outside of the Aburame clan. I would like to introduce my father to you. Haruki sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, he would have to meet the last two clan heads sooner or later, so it might as well be now. Alright, but on one condition. Both boys blinked at him. Go get a bowl of ramen together. Both genin looked taken aback, glancing at each other before looking back at him. Haruki held back a smile and nodded firmly. Go on. I'll meet you at the park near the academy tomorrow at 6 if you go get dinner together. Consider it boys only team bonding training. Hurry up. The two boys blinked at him again before Kiba shrugged and grinned a little, less cautious and friendlier. Shino remained stoic but he nodded once and made no move to protest. Haruki grinned inwardly. It was a start. He waved the two boys off and didn't start moving away until they disappeared around a corner, Kiba already talking a mile a minute about something or other. Satisfied, Haruki turned and headed back to his own apartment. Overall, he supposed he did an okay job with Team 8. He had given them a push in the right direction and he hoped it was enough to cement the team together. Resting beside the hospital bed in the uncomfortable plastic chair, Yugo listened to the steady beep 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 of the heart monitor and offered up thanks once again for the umpteenth time that day. Her boyfriend was going to live. Hayate would live a long and healthy life, missions notwithstanding. And she couldn't even thank the right person for it because she didn't know who it was. I'm sorry, but he doesn't wish to have his name revealed, Takumi shrugged apologetically at them. Yugo clutched at Hayate's hand as the man slept on, for once undisturbed by rasping coughs. But I have to thank him, she said earnestly. I didn't think this could ever happen. I have to at least thank him. Takumi merely shook his head. He doesn't want you to know, and I gave him my word that I wouldn't say. Yugo's face fell. But why would he do this and not want anything in return? Here, the doctor smiled, genuine and thoughtful. He is something of a rarity these days. I asked him what he wanted in return for the cure and he got angry with me. He chuckled. Refused payment right then and there. Yugo couldn't help the bewilderment that surfaced on her face. But why would he help Hayate specifically? Takumi smiled again. Yugo-chan, there are people out there who help just because they can. He seems to be one of them. He turned to leave, tossing one last comment over his shoulder. You two have a very good friend. Perhaps one day, if you ever find out, you might be inclined to help him in return. He certainly looks like he needs it. Yugo leaned forward and rested her head on the edge of the bed, cheek against the white sheets. What did the medic mean by that? Was their mysterious benefactor in some sort of trouble? And did Takumi really mean that he was a friend? But why would any of their friends keep something like this from them? Yugo. The sleep-roughed voice stirred her from her position and she quickly jerked up, leaning over her lover anxiously. It was the first time Hayate had woken up since going through the surgery. Hayate, you're awake. How do you feel? Hayate smiled sleepily up at her. Fine. Great. I don't think I've ever been able to breathe so well. Yugo almost burst into tears as a wave of relief crashed into her. Takumi had assured her that the surgery had been a success, but it was far better to hear it straight from Hayate. I'm so glad, she whispered, clasping one of her boyfriend's hands again. Takumi-san said that you'll need to rest for a couple more days, just to get any lingering side effects of the treatment out of your system, but you're going to be back to full strength really soon. Hayate quirked another crooked smile at her, the one that always made her feel like the luckiest woman alive, and yes, she definitely was, because how many other women with terminally ill boyfriends were suddenly given another chance right out of the blue? So did you have any luck finding out who saved my life? Yugo shook her head, absently lacing her fingers with Hayate's. No, Takumi-san wouldn't tell me. But I think he did say it was a friend though. Hayate's brow furrowed. All our friends act like they're walking on ice when they talk about my sickness. They'd never be able to keep something like this a secret. Yugo nodded in agreement. Well, whoever it is doesn't want to be known. Hayate arched an eyebrow at her. I don't suppose that's going to stop you. Yugo grinned back. Of course not. I'll do some digging. Surely someone must know something. Hayate chuckled, shifting a little. I'll leave you to it then. In the meantime, when should we tell the others? Yugo brightened, eyes dancing. Do you really think I was going to keep it from them any longer than necessary? I sent Sai off with messages a while ago. She's to deliver them the moment you woke up. Her cat summon had the odd ability to communicate telepathically with her from certain distances. Quite useful in tight situations. Hayate gave her a puzzled look. You told them I've been cured with pieces of paper. Yugo scowled good-naturedly at him. Of course not. I just told them that you're in the hospital and to come right away. Hayate started, eyes widening as he pushed himself up. What? Wait. Then there. Hayate. The door burst open and Kotetsu and Azumo piled in, looking frantic and prepared for the worst. Another flurry of footsteps sounded behind them and Anko, Raida, and Genma pushed their way in as well. Anko's expression was darker than a storm cloud, brow furrowed as she tried to cover up the anxiety flashing in her eyes. Beside her, Raida's lips were pressed tightly together and he began scanning Hayate as if by simply looking hard enough, he would be able to tell what was wrong. And bringing up the rear was Genma, who looked as calm and collected as ever, Sanbon stuck in his mouth, but his face was almost completely white and the brown eyes that surveyed him were narrowed with tightly reined apprehension. Hayate, what's wrong? Why are you in here? A relapse. The fuck is the doctor? Shouldn't he be here doing his fucking job? How do you feel? Nausea, fever, pain. Are you even dying? Genma's pointed question overrode everyone else's babbling and they all turned to stare at him. The Sanbon wielder's face seemed less pale now as he studied the Kenjutsu expert sitting up in the hospital bed. He had come in expecting the worst news possible, that his longtime friend had finally used up his 9 lives fighting the disease and they were supposed to come and say their last goodbyes. He had almost thrown up when he had gotten Yugo's message. But when he had walked in, inwardly terrified to the core, his friend's rapid-fire questions had given him enough time to take in the situation and he had noticed the light in Yugo's eyes and the relaxed slant of Hayate's shoulders, no longer tensed to stave off continuous bouts of coughing. On the bed, Hayate sighed and shot his girlfriend an exasperated look. Yugo grinned sheepishly. Whoops. Whoops. Anko snapped, taking another step forward. What? Whoops. What the hell's going on? Both Yugo and Hayate smiled at this, bright and happy. Hayate spread his arms, smile morphing into a small grin. All cured. Stunned silence descended on the room and Yugo hurried on with an explanation. Early this morning, someone approached Takumi-san and gave him the cure for Hayate's sickness. Takumi-san called us in, explained the treatment, did the surgery to remove the disease, and here we are. She leaned in, pressing closer to Hayate. He's all cured. Totally and completely cured. Nobody moved for several long seconds and the ticking of the clock on one white wall echoed loudly around them. And then Kotetsu and Azumo were surging forward, all but tackling Hayate as Yugo hastily backed away, laughing and almost crying at the same time. Anko whooped happily, bounding forward as well as she promised to buy Hayate a number of sweets that he had previously been unable to eat. Raida and Genma remained a few feet away but Raida was grinning broadly and Genma was smiling around his Sanbon, shoulders slumped in relief. 10 minutes later, when they had all calmed down enough that the nurses had finally stopped threatening to kick them out, Raida inevitably asked, so who exactly approached Kano-sensei? Or are you not supposed to say? Yugo shook her head. We don't know either. Takumi-san promised him that he wouldn't say anything. She glanced at them. Though I guess your reactions rule out you lot. Azumo frowned a little. Rule us out. Why would we have anything to do with it? Hayate shrugged, now reclining against the raised bed. Apparently, whoever he is, he's supposed to be a friend. Dude, Kotetsu quirked a smile at him. I think anyone who saves your life can be considered a friend. But the way Takumi-san said it made it sound as if he knew us. Yugo spoke up again. And he said that whoever he is seems like he needs help too. Hayate glanced sharply at her, having not heard that part yet. Needs help. Is he hurt? In trouble? Yugo shook her head again. Takumi-san said he certainly looks like he needs it. Could be both. Well, if he needs help, Anko announced. We'll just find him and do that. We can all do some poking around. There was a general round of agreement from all of them before Kotetsu and Azumo turned the conversation to something lighter, filling them in on the fun they had had earlier that day during the training exercise that Haruki had invited them to take part in. Anko chimed in enviously, grouchy that she hadn't been invited as well until Raida reminded her that she had been away on border patrol with him and Genma. None of them noticed the thoughtful frown that passed over Genma's face as the red-haired Junin was brought up. It was a few hours later before the nurses finally had enough of them and shooed them out. They all departed for the day, promising that they would return early the next morning. Hayate just waved them out cheerfully, falling back on the bed to get the first peaceful night of sleep since he could remember. As Genma made his way home, waving a lazy goodnight to his friends when they parted, his mind turned back to the sneaking suspicion that had crept up on him the moment Yugo and Hayate had revealed what little information they had on their benefactor. A friend. Someone who knew them. Or more accurately, someone who knew of Hayate's sickness and had most likely found out only recently. And someone who looked like they needed help. There was only one person Genma could think of that fit all four descriptions. But why? Why would Haruki not want them to find out? Surely the Junin wouldn't mind some appreciation from them all. But did it really matter? Haruki had helped Hayate without asking for anything in return, had acted like a real friend would even though they had only just met the day before. And judging from Kotetsu and Azumo's recount of their day, the red-haired Junin seemed to honestly want to help the people around him, from 12-year-old genin to terminally ill adults. As far as Genma was concerned, that was enough to convince him of the redhead's sincerity. Takumi had said that Haruki seemed to need help, and after the fainting episode yesterday and the fatigue that Genma had noticed was always weighing the man down, the Senbon wielder fully agreed with the assessment. If Haruki didn't want anyone to know what he had done for whatever reason, then Genma would respect that. The others would find out eventually anyway. But that didn't mean he couldn't keep an eye on the redhead in the meantime, just to make sure he didn't do anything recklessly stupid or keeled over again because he was too stubborn to go to the hospital. After all, it was the least Genma could do for the man who had saved one of his closest friends from a premature death. XX. As Sume rushed towards her village's gates with Kuromaru loping at her side and Shibi on her tail, she expected to head straight to the Hokage Tower, check in with the Sandame, be briefed on whatever the hell was happening with the Hyugas at the moment, and then go home and crash for the next 10 hours. That didn't happen. Ka-chan. Welcome home. Sume skidded to a stop in front of the main gates, feeling mildly bemused as her son bounded up to her, Akamaru on his head and an excited grin on his face, and wasn't that Shibi's kid behind him? Ah, I'm back, Sume managed to return. What's with the personal reception, brat? Come on. Shino and I wanna introduce you to someone. Her son glanced at her mission partner as he stepped up beside her. And Shino's dad too, of course. Come on. Sume shared a look with Shibi, not bothering to hide her bewilderment. Shino and I. Last time she checked, their sons didn't get along at all. What the hell was going on? What the hell is going on? She demanded, crossing her arms and ignoring the warning elbow she got from Shibi to curb her language. What are you planning, Kiba? Her son took on a mildly hurt countenance and glanced at Shibi's son for support. And Shino stepped up to give it. Had the world flipped itself when she wasn't looking? Kiba is not planning anything. Sume-sama, Shino started in that stilted way all Aburame talked in. We simply wish to introduce both of you to someone we know. Drop the sama, kid. Seriously, Sume told him absently as she stared between the two of them, standing companionably next to each other. She traded another glance with Shibi. Her former teammate and longtime field partner looked as emotionless as ever to most people, but Sume could pick out the confusion in the slight frown creasing the man's brow. Oh good. So it wasn't just her then. Who is this person then? Sume finally asked, letting her son tug her along as they entered Konoha while Shibi followed at a more sedate pace. She flicked a glance at Kuromaru and the dog nodded and loped off towards home. Her partner deserved some rest after such a long mission. A Junin, Shino spoke first, and since when did an Aburame speak first, especially in the presence of an Inuzuka? He was our temporary sensei yesterday. Why you ask? Because Kurenai-sensei invited him to join us. He helped with our tracking skills. The Aburame heir trailed off and glanced at Kiba with an almost thoughtful air. And our teamwork. I see. Sume really didn't see because she had always thought that it would take months and a miracle for their sons to see eye to eye. She and Shibi hadn't gotten along at first either, and it had only been after their third mission when she had been saved by her reticent teammate that she had started to see him as something more than an annoyance, and she had thought that Kiba would be the same. Walking beside her, Shibi observed his son from behind. Shino was still keeping several inches between himself and his boisterous partner, but he didn't shy away or step to the side when Sume's son brushed against him. What had happened? His son usually came home from the academy in a typically silent but foul mood whenever he had a brush in with Kiba. Granted, He hadn't seen Shino in almost 2 months, missing his graduation because of the damn mission, but surely being put on the same team wouldn't suddenly make them friends. As if sensing his gaze, Shino turned to look over his shoulder and glanced up at him. Otu-san. Shibi blinked behind his sunglasses. Which Junin is it, Shino? His son cocked his head. Kazama Haruki. Recently returned from an extended mission. A short pause. He is respectful of our bugs, Otu-san. Shibi's eyebrows shot up a fraction even as Kiba jumped in enthusiastically, and it's like he understands Akamaru. I mean, he says he doesn't really, but he can guess what Akamaru's saying. Right, boy. Akamaru yipped happily, wagging his tail. Kiba laughed. That's right. Haruki-san spoils you with treats too. Ka-chan, Haruki-san knows how to treat our dogs properly. Before he came to train us, he bought a bag of the food that only Inuzuka dogs eat. Shibi glanced at his former teammate, noting the consternation on her face. He knew the food Inuzukas fed their dogs were only sold in one specific store and was completely run by the Inuzuka clan. One would have to do some very fast talking and have a very good reason to buy anything from them. Who was manning the store? Sum demanded. Kiba looked confused at the annoyed tone that his mother had taken on. Nei-chan was. Sum blinked, stunned. Her own daughter, who was almost as protective of her clan's dogs and secrets as she was, had sold their specially developed food to some Junin Sum had never heard of. Who was this guy? We told him to wait for us at the park near the academy, Kiba continued, walking even faster now. Hurry up. 5 minutes later, they walked into the park and Kiba pointed excitedly, there he is. That's him, Ka-chan. Sum squinted at the red-haired shinobi. He had his back turned so she couldn't see his face, but she was sure she had never laid eyes on any ninja with hair that color for a long time. Do you know him, Shibi? She muttered quietly, glancing beside her. Shibi shook his head minutely, eyes glued to the shinobi across the playground. Moments later, he felt his Kikaichu stir. He frowned. They recognized the Junin to some degree. He silently asked for a clarification, but his bugs didn't seem all that inclined to answer him. Shibi only managed to pick up detached whispers that didn't particularly make much sense. Familiar. Descendant. Know him, strong, very strong, stronger than the one before. Sad, so very sad. Sacrifice. Alone, always alone. Lost forever. Danger. Help him. Shibi quickly cut the connection, mind racing. Though Kikaichu only lived for several hours, they had the ability to pass on knowledge to each generation after them, retaining a long memory of people they had come into contact with even decades after. Remarkably, they were also able to sense a shinobi's chakra as well as anything they had come into contact with, and pick up on their emotional state to an extent. A useful skill when judging an enemy shinobi's condition in a fight. But Shibi had never met anyone who could cause such a strong reaction from his bugs. Obviously, this Kazama Haruki reminded them of someone that their earlier generations had met before. But Shibi didn't know any ninja with this Junin surname. And his Kikaichu, who usually simply reported back to him as they were trained to do, were openly insisting on giving assistance, as if they sensed something of great enough importance that helping this shinobi was for the best. Kikaichu didn't live long. As helpful as they were to the Aburame clan, they didn't particularly care whether or not their hosts died and vice versa. They simply moved on once their chakra supply was cut off. Death was literally part of life for them and they didn't have complicated feelings about it like humans did. But did this mean that something was going to happen, something big enough that even the Kikaichu were worried? Shibi, what's wrong with you? Sum hissed beside him, gaze sharp. Shibi shrugged a little, trying to settle down again. My bugs recognize him to some degree. Sum glanced at the red-haired Junin again. I don't sense malicious intent. Your bugs. Shibi remained silent for a moment before replying slowly, they seem partial to him. Sum did a double take. They like him. Shibi's frown deepened. Something has them worried. Sum tensed, hand automatically drifting down to her hip pouch. Is it this guy? Because I've never seen him before. I don't care how long a mission he's been on. I've never laid eyes on him before. Shibi glanced sharply at her. No. They are worried for him. Sum pulled up, hand dropping back to her side. What? Why? Shibi shook his head. I do not know. Before either of them could say anything more, the Junin they had been discussing turned to face them, and both took an immediate sprint down memory lane as brilliant cerulean pinned them in place. Shibi, Soom murmured without looking away from the blue-eyed Junin. Is it just me, or does this guy remind you of the Yondaime? Shibi finished gravely. He would never forget their old friend's eyes. Minato always seemed to be able to look straight into a person's soul with them, and even from this distance, Shibi got the exact same feeling from this shinobi. Are you two alright? They both blinked and tore their gazes away from the red-haired Junin to look down at their children. Kiba was blinking up at them with confusion, and even Shino had raised a questioning eyebrow. We're fine, brats, Soom told them briskly. Now are you going to introduce us or not? We don't have all day. Haruki-san. Sorry to keep ya waiting. Haruki smiled down at the two boys of Team 8 as they approached, Shibi and Soom several feet behind their children. Don't worry about it. I wasn't waiting long. How are you today? Still tired from yesterday? Kiba grinned up at him. Nope. I bounce right back. And Akamaru's back to full strength too. Akamaru yipped and leapt off Kiba's head, settling in the arms that automatically came out to catch him. He liked this person. Haruki smelled like sunlight and summer and always gave him treats. And whenever Akamaru snuggled against him, some of the loneliness he could sense disappeared as well. He hoped his human visited this man more often. Kiba seemed less angry and more relaxed ever since meeting Haruki. Akamaru would have to do his best to repay him. Haruki sighed as the white pup made himself comfortable in his arms. Kiba-kun, I think there is something wrong with Akamaru. He keeps doing this. Kiba grinned even wider, baring sharp canine teeth. He just likes ya, so ya better get used to it. He's gonna be doing that a lot. Haruki just sighed again and turned to Shino. And how are you, Shino-kun? How's that new jutsu coming along? Shino nodded once. I am fine. The jutsu is difficult. I am still working on it, but I have improved the distance to 5 meters since I started making chakra threads. That is much harder to do. Haruki nodded, not missing the minuscule but sharp jerk of Shibi's head. Keep at it then. When you can extend them from all your fingers at the same time, I'll teach you how to attach them to objects so you can move them. Shino nodded back, silent again, but there was a hint of a smile peeking out from behind his collar. Haruki smiled back, amused as he watched the younger version of his friend, before finally looking up at the two adults still standing several paces away. And these are your parents then? Oh yeah. Kiba bounded back to his mother. What was wrong with her today? He didn't usually have to drag her anywhere. Maybe she was tired from her mission. This is my mum, Soom. Ka-chan. This is Haruki-san. Soom stepped forward, eyes narrowed as she studied the redhead. Haruki only smiled back and nodded a greeting. Hello, Soom-san. Kiba's talked about you. Soom arched an eyebrow. So this Junin knew not to call her by the formal honorific. Did Kiba mention that to him? Oh, what about? She knew her son. Kiba wouldn't hold back on the comments. He would have told Haruki both good and bad. Haruki tilted his head, considering the woman in front of him. He knew how to handle Soom from his time. The woman was loyal to the core, as were all Inuzukas. She appreciated honesty, no matter how harsh, and detested sugar-coated words and traitors more than anything else. So, impatient, Haruki stared steadily back at the clan head, catching the surprise that flitted across her face and ignoring the slightly nervous look on Kiba's. Short-tempered, tough, quite frightening when lecturing Kiba-kun. But your son says that's okay because he knows you love him anyway. Haruki-san. Kiba spluttered, looking embarrassed and indignant. Haruki smiled innocently down at him. You did say that, Kiba-kun. You're not supposed to repeat it to her. The younger Inuzuka sibling wailed, face red. He yelped when Soom suddenly laughed and slung an arm around his shoulders. Soom could only stare in astonishment as Haruki told her straight to her face what he had heard. Of course, it sounded just like her son, but she really hadn't expected the Junin to repeat it word for word. Most people took one look at her and quailed. Haruki looked at her without the slightest bit of apprehension. Hearing the end of Kiba's account of her, she couldn't help but bark out a laugh as a rush of affection welled up inside her. That last part she hadn't expected. Soom's fine. she told the redhead as she straightened up and offered him a sharp smile. I hear you've been teaching them. Haruki shrugged. Just for a day. Kurenai invited me. Kiba grinned proudly. It was really hard, but we managed it in the end. He blinked, glancing up at Shibi as if suddenly remembering his presence before reaching over to poke his teammate. Oi, Shino. Introductions. Shino arched an eyebrow at Kiba but didn't get too annoyed. Yesterday was still fresh in his mind. He turned a little to his father instead. Otu-san, this is Haruki-san. Haruki-san, my father, Aburame Shibi. Haruki's greeting to him came just as freely as it did to Sume. Shibi nodded briefly back, noting how the Junin's gaze seemed to slice right through his sunglasses and straight to his eyes. He wanted to ask more, very out of character for him, but he wanted to know why his Kikaichu picked up such a tangled mess of emotions when all Shibi could see right now was a warm smile and a cheerful countenance. But, well, we'd like to talk more, but we haven't reported into the Hokage yet, Sume said briskly, one hand on top of Kiba's hood. Maybe later, Haruki. Haruki nodded quickly. Sarutobi would need to fill them in before he called everyone together tomorrow. Of course, I won't Ki. He stiffened and glanced to the right, as did Shibi and Sume. The children looked confused and Akamaru raised his head, sniffing the air questioningly. Ah, Haruki rubbed the back of his head. I suppose it would be bad manners to run away right now. Sume glanced curiously at him. Run away. It's just Shikaku. Man's not that bad. Granted, he could lighten up a bit, but it could be worse. Haruki just heaved another sigh, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. Ma, that's not it. He's been looking for you for the last 3 days. If I didn't know better, Haruki, I'd say you've been avoiding me. The sarcasm was thick in the Junin commander's voice and Haruki inwardly winced as he turned around to face the Nara head. Good evening, Shikaku. Shikaku stared menacingly at him, torn between wanting to wring the redhead's neck for forcing him to endure so many troublesome hours and congratulating the man for avoiding him so well. He knew Anbuhu couldn't hide from him, which only served to pique his curiosity even more. You are a difficult man to track down, Haruki, he finally said, frowning irritably at the redhead. Haruki tried a Kakashi-eye smile as his lips tilted up unrepentantly. Ma, I didn't want to play another round of shogi so soon. Shikaku just sighed before glancing at the newly returned clan heads standing behind the Junin. Shibi, Sume, good to see you back. He frowned again as he glanced at Haruki. They needed to be filled in soon. You need to head over to the Hokage Tower. Sandame Sama's been expecting you. Both shinobi heard the weight in his voice and they quickly nodded. I'll see you at home, Kiba. Sume ruffled her son's hair before giving a general nod at the others and shining away. Shibi patted his son on the shoulder before following his old teammate. He would ask Shino about Haruki when he got home, and inquire about the chakra threads as well. Well, see ya later, Haruki-san. Kiba waved as Akamaru jumped back onto his head. The dog yipped as well, looking almost expectant. Haruki chuckled and reached into a pocket to withdraw a small bag of dog treats. That's it. Akamaru snapped up the treat, wagging vigorously as his best friend laughed below him. Haruki was quickly becoming one of his favorite humans. See you tomorrow, Kiba-kun, Shino-kun. Haruki glanced up at the darkening sky. Go straight home, alright. It's getting late. Both boys nodded before heading off in their compound's direction. It helped that their homes were so close to each other. Haruki watched them go before turning warily back to Shikaku. The man had watched the entire exchange quietly, content to wait Haruki out. So, Haruki began, slouching a little in his coat. You want a match? Partly, Shikaku agreed. At the moment, I mostly just want to figure you out. Haruki eyed him dryly. You'd suck as an interrogator. Shikaku shrugged easily, motioning for Haruki to join him as he headed away from the park. That's why I leave that job to Inoichi. Or Ibiki now. They walked in easy silence for a while. Despite Shikaku's desire to figure out his secret, Haruki was almost completely relaxed in this man's company. The Nara clan head wasn't all that different in the future, always a steady, solid presence that Haruki had learned to depend on. Of course, there would be no depending here, but that didn't mean that he couldn't feel comfortable around the Junin commander. Inoichi is worried about you. Shikaku started again, glancing sidelong at the redhead. Haruki nodded. I heard. I don't know why. Shikaku dearly wanted to ask, have you looked in a mirror lately, but held his tongue. You haven't been by the Yamanaka flowers either, he said instead. Haruki shrugged. Inoichi is one of your best friends. He wouldn't have let me leave until you came. Would that be such a bad thing? Shikaku asked dryly. I simply have a theory I wish to confirm. Haruki automatically scoffed, amused and nostalgic in equal parts. Of course you have a theory. A Nara without theories is a dead Nara. A slightly stilted silence followed as Haruki blinked at the odd look on Shikaku's face. Be careful with your words, Haruki, Shikaku said at last, and Haruki frowned a little as a belated alarm bell rang in the back of his mind. You have the disturbing tendency to repeat things that you shouldn't know. Haruki frowned a little more and repeated his words in his head. A Nara without theories is a dead Nara. He had heard this from Shikamaru, but it wasn't something his chief strategist had ever voiced as a kid. This time Shikamaru shouldn't have said it yet. My wife once said that to me, Shikaku revealed quietly, face half hidden in shadows as they passed under an alcove. Haruki remained stubbornly blank-faced. Before Shikamaru was born. As a joke, of course. His head tilted in a mockingly contemplative manner. But I could swear you've never met Yoshino before. Haruki walked on, refusing to acknowledge Shikaku's faint smirk and cursing himself inside his head. And of course, the Junin commander continued relentlessly. The day you trained my son and his team, you repeated my words as well. And I know I have never said them to Shikamaru, and it would be somewhat redundant to say them to someone who isn't a Nara. Strange, isn't it? In his coat, Haruki's hands clenched into fists. How the hell had their conversation deteriorated to this point so quickly? There were times that he hated this side of Shikaku. The ruthless, uncompromising shinobi who excelled at continually boxing in his target even after they were completely cornered with no way out. Even worse was that Shikaku wielded this skill like he would a piece in a shogi game, seemingly careless, outwardly effortless, and utterly destructive. In the future, Shikaku had passed this skill on to his son, and during the few times either of them had carelessly turned it on him, Haruki had been beyond pissed off. He had spent his entire childhood running, always running, and knew the pain and fear of being surrounded with no way out. It was why, when he had to kill, he almost always made sure to do it as quickly as possible. If someone was going to die either way, the terror that set in if a kill was drawn out too long was unnecessary. They were ninja, not psychopaths, though he'd seen the two combined more than once in his life. At the moment though, Haruki was facing a friend, someone he would gladly die for, and the man was playing mind games with him. Maybe he would have to retract his previous statement. Shikaku could give Inoichi a run for his money when he was like this. I've made you angry. Shikaku's sudden observation, quiet and a touch apologetic, snapped Haruki out of his thoughts but not his anger. Damn straight, he snapped back, low and dark and not bothering to hide the fury and, even after all this time, just the smallest amount of panic that roared in his chest. Either get to the point or get lost, Shikaku. Don't turn that cornering crap on me. Shikaku almost stepped back at the unveiled tangle of emotion that made Haruki's eyes blaze. Shit, he had overstepped his boundaries. It occasionally happened when he was angry or when he caught onto something interesting that kept him occupied for more than a couple days. The habit had slowly gotten better after Inoichi had taken him aside one day, years ago, after he had reduced a fellow shinobi to a shaking heap of fear for insulting Yoshino, and had warned him of the consequences of what he could so easily do. You're smart, Shikaku, Inoichi had told him, blue eyes intent. And that brain of yours is as deadly as any weapon, but you have to be careful. Say the wrong thing one too many times and you could destroy someone's mind. I don't care if you do it to enemy nin, but keep a lid on it when it comes to allies. You could seriously hurt them. And here he was, doing the exact same thing Inoichi had warned him not to do to someone that Shikaku knew didn't have the best mental health at the moment. Shit. I apologize, he said quickly, automatically raising his hands in a placating gesture when gleaming cerulean narrowed. It's a bad habit. I did not mean to turn on you like that. Haruki studied the Junin commander for a moment longer, struggling to shove his emotions back down as he did so. He took a quiet deep breath, slowly letting it out along with his anger and then immediately wishing he hadn't. Now that he was no longer angry, the heavy exhaustion from before seemed to come back in full force, settling on his shoulders like deadweight once again. What do you want, Shikaku? Haruki suppressed the urge to close his eyes. God, he just wanted to go back to his apartment and rest, maybe even risk sleeping for a few hours. Shikaku stayed silent for a long moment. A part of him wanted to just leave and call it a night. It was obvious that he had just botched their entire conversation. But a bigger part of him, the shinobi side, the strategist side, the Nara side, wanted to know. I was going to ask you for another shogi match, Shikaku spoke at last, choosing his words carefully. Just to verify some things, but I'm pretty sure I've already figured it out, so I won't. All I want right now is a confirmation. This time, Haruki did close his eyes, sighing deeply before opening them again. What exactly do you know right now? Quote. You have the Kyuubi sealed inside you, Shikaku started after making sure Haruki really did want to know. You have Namikaze Minato's eyes, and your face is a bit like his. I thought you were his brother or cousin, but I forgot to consider his wife, and you have her smile and mainly her facial structure. So I'm inclined to believe that your hair color is a henge, and you've hidden the whisker marks on your face because you can only be one person. But that should be impossible because Uzumaki Naruto is just a boy and I know you have not hanged into one or the other. You have the Hokage's ear, you repeat words that you shouldn't know, you navigate the Nara compound like a second home, and, Shikaku stopped for a heartbeat, watching the shadows creep into those sorrowful eyes again before ending softly, and apparently, you look at my son and you see someone else, someone you can't bear to look at. Whatever light that remained in Haruki's eyes flickered out and Shikaku almost wanted to take every word back as a deadened gaze stared back at him. But he had come this far, said this much, and he needed to push because if he was right, and he knew he was then Haruki needed help since there was just no way he could do everything alone, no matter how strong he was. So he continued, concluding in a gravelly voice that was barely above a murmur, one person from two different times. You were Uzumaki Naruto from the future, from a different timeline, from a world beyond repair. So you came back, to change things. Shikaku stared hard as dull blue eyes closed. Am I correct, Haruki? Haruki didn't answer him directly, only opening his eyes and turning to stare down a surprisingly empty street. The sunlight was almost completely gone by now and most people had headed home for dinner. Bodies and ashes, Haruki finally spoke, and Shikaku contained a shudder at the raw-haunted expression that finally surfaced on the redhead's face. Can you imagine Konoha reduced to nothing but bodies and ashes? And everyone dead. Everyone. Babies, children, civilians, shinobi. All gone. He turned back. Can you imagine that, Shikaku? Because, funny enough, until I saw it myself, I couldn't imagine it either. It won't happen. Shikaku was startled to hear how rough his voice had become but continued anyway, looking the time traveler in the eye. We won't let it. Haruki smiled, humorless. We, Shikaku. Yes, Shikaku frowned sternly at the Junin. I don't know what kind of person I'll become in the future. I can only speak for myself in the present. I know what's going on now. Don't think I'll let you handle this on your own, especially if Konoha's on the line. The Sandaime has told Inoichi that you can't be helped, that we should simply leave you alone. I won't lie and promise you that everything will be alright. After everything you've been through, maybe you'll never completely heal, I don't know. But the Hokage is wrong to leave everything to you. We can at least try. Haruki stared at him, expression twisting a little in a way that Shikaku couldn't read. You're exactly the same, the redhead finally muttered, shoulders hunching just a bit. You wouldn't leave me or Shika alone in the future either. He glanced up, a morbid smile curling at the corners of his lips. It got you killed. Shikaku didn't blink. I'll be more careful this time around. Haruki snorted but Shikaku felt something loosen in his gut when some of the dead expression lifted from the Junin's face and blue eyes became a little more alive again. I won't tell you everything, Haruki said at last. I might not even come close to telling you half of that. Shikaku shrugged, shoving his hands into his coat as he walked forward, unbelievably glad when Haruki didn't move away from him. That's fine. So long as you warn me of something that's about to happen so we can prevent it, I won't push anymore. Much. he added as an afterthought. Haruki let out a sound that was a half laugh, half sob. But his shoulders relaxed and he walked willingly enough beside Shikaku as they moved aimlessly down the street again. You called my son Shika, Shikaku recalled. You were good friends then. Haruki smiled a little, more genuine this time. More like brothers. I made him my chief strategist. Other chief strategist anyway. I kept you on until you, well. Shikaku nodded thoughtfully and absently wondered how he had died. Ah, Rokudaime Hokage, I assume. Haruki nodded but didn't expand on it and Shikaku didn't ask. Instead, I haven't had sake in 3 days because of you. Let's go to Shushuya. You can tell me who knows what over dinner. Haruki bit back a smile as he nodded and followed the Nara clan head to the popular restaurant. It was strange. He had thought that it would complicate matters if more people found out, had thought that maybe Shikaku would insist on knowing everything right away, but the man had never, at any point in time, rushed into things without thinking it over first. And Naras were always smart enough to know when to defer to someone else when they weren't as knowledgeable in the area. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad then. The Sandaime knew, but the Hokage could hardly sit around all day listening to tales of another time if they weren't relevant to any immediate danger. And while Hazashi knew, Haruki wasn't all that comfortable relying on someone whom he had never known in any time. But Shikaku was someone he was familiar with, even if this was a younger version of him. Haruki had properly met the Nara head when he was 15, so a couple years wouldn't make much of a difference. And Shikaku was patient and a good listener and an excellent advisor. He had been a steady rock for Haruki right up until the day he died, so maybe depending on this man in this timeline was something he could do after all. Besides, it didn't look like Shikaku was going to give him much of a choice anyway. Shikaku heaved a tired sigh as he sat down on the wooden porch, reaching down to take off his sandals. What a night. Hyuga Hazashi was the only person other than the Sandaime who knew the truth. No wonder Haruki looked so tired all the time. He doubted the Hyuga clan head's brother had been much help. Hyugas were an emotionally stunted lot. Even if Hazashi was better than the rest, he doubted that the man would ever go out of his way to take on such an emotional mess like Haruki. Shikaku stifled a yawn before glancing up to smile at his wife. Sorry I'm late, Yoshino. Got held up with some business. Yoshino could no doubt smell the alcohol on him, but Shikaku had always marveled at her ability to tell when he was giving a half-assed excuse and when he was serious, even when he said both in the same tone of voice. His wife only nodded before taking a seat next to him, leaning into him when he curled an arm around her waist. Can you imagine Konoha reduced to nothing but bodies and ashes? And everyone dead. Everyone. Babies, children, civilians, shinobi. All gone. Can you imagine that, Shikaku? Because, funny enough, until I saw it myself, I couldn't imagine it either. His arm tightened just a little around Yoshino and his other arm suddenly felt a little empty without his son beside him. No, he couldn't imagine it, couldn't see it at all, and God he hoped he never would. He had always known that real Kages were a rare breed of shinobi, set apart from the rest of the population, but he had always contemplated on what it was that made them different. Physical and mental strength, of course, but it couldn't just be that. Charisma and a genuine desire to protect the village and its people, but Shikaku had seen quite a few shinobi like that as well. So perhaps it was what he had seen in Haruki tonight. The will and resolve to never give up, to sacrifice not the people but himself to protect what was important. To keep on going even after everything had been destroyed. To put the people who followed him above everything else. The Shodaime had been like that, killed in the many battles of the First Great Shinobi War, but not before passing on his will of fire to the next generations of Konohagakure. The Nadaime had been that way as well, sacrificing himself to give Konoha a future in Sarutobi Hiruzen. The Sandaime had lost 2 teachers, a student, a wife, a successor, and many shinobi in the Third War, and had still come back to take up the mantle to keep the village going. And the Yondaime, of course, had sacrificed himself and both his family members to ensure Konoha's survival from the Kyubi. But his old friend would be disgusted with the very village he had protected if he ever saw his son's abysmal childhood. Shikaku, are you all right? His wife's concerned voice made him blink and he managed a small smile for her. Of course, Yoshino. I just have a lot on my mind. More theories, Shikaku. Her gentle teasing warmed his heart. He'd do anything to keep this in his life. Well, you know us, Shikaku grinned a little, repeating her words even as he recalled his earlier conversation. Naris without theories are dead Naris. Yoshino huffed exasperatedly, but her mouth curled up into a smile. Just don't think too much. You'll get frown lines if you do. She settled against him again and Shikaku turned to look up at the moon. They had a chance now. Haruki had come all the way back, 14 years into the past, and Shikaku would be damned if the same thing happened again.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.